Hey fam, this is Wizardium. Today's story is gonna blow your mind. What if Harry and Hermione were raised by the Marauders as soulmates? Show some love with a like and subscribe. Here we go. Chapter 1. The night two children reached for each other. The rain came sideways on Spinner's End, and Sirius Black stood in the middle of a street that smelled like wet coal and old grief, staring at the sky because he didn't know where else to look. James was dead. He'd said it 3 times already, standing over the rubble in Godric's Hollow with Hagrid's enormous shadow at his back. And each time the words had just fallen out of his mouth like stones dropping into deep water. No splash, no echo, just gone. Lily too. Both of them gone in the span of a single night, and the only thing left behind was a 1-year-old boy with a lightning bolt scar on his forehead and Lily's green eyes blinking up at him from beneath a piece of collapsed ceiling. And somehow Sirius had let Hagrid take the baby. He'd handed over his godson. He'd given over his motorbike and watched Hagrid lumber into the sky with Harry wrapped in a bundle of blankets. And he'd done it because there was one more thing he had to check on first. One more loose thread. Emma and Dan Granger were dead. He knew that before he even turned onto their street. The dark mark hung over the house like a brand, green and serpentine, curling lazily in the rainy night as if it hadn't just ended 2 people who'd done nothing wrong except exist adjacent to the war. Sirius had known Emma Granger not well but enough. She'd been at St. Mungo's for a dental consultation that turned into a conversation with a healer who thought she was Muggle-born and was wrong. And somehow that afternoon had ended with Emma having a fireplace connection and a standing invitation to Lily's kitchen table. A Muggle woman who'd learned to drink tea while owls came and went through the window. She hadn't flinched once. The front door of the house was open. Not blown off its hinges the way Godric's Hollow had been, just open, swinging slightly in the wet wind, like someone had left in a hurry or arrived the same way. Sirius drew his wand and went inside. The downstairs was wrecked. Not structurally, not the way a killing curse tore through plaster and wood when it missed, but ransacked deliberately the way Death Eaters operated when they had time and contempt in equal measure. Bookshelves emptied onto the floor. A child's drawing pinned to the refrigerator with a round magnet, half scorched by something, still showing crayon colors through the burn. A small table by the door with keys and a bowl of change and a framed photograph of a young couple with a baby, and the baby had brown eyes and a serious expression at 8 months old that made Sirius's chest do something complicated. He cleared the stairs in 6 steps. The nursery was at the end of the hall. The door was intact. When Sirius pushed it open, the smell hit him first. Ozone, which was wrong, sharp and electric, the smell the air gets after a lightning strike or a very large piece of accidental magic. He stood in the doorway and tried to make sense of what he was seeing. There were 2 children in the cot. That was the first impossible thing. The cot was a standard baby's cot, white-painted wood, slightly scuffed at the base, with a mobile of wooden stars hanging above it. And it held exactly 1 child more than it should have. Hermione Granger, who was 18 months old and had a head full of dark curls and a tear-streaked face, was sitting upright in the corner of the cot. And pressed against her side, sleeping with an exhausted completeness that looked less like normal infant sleep and more like the sleep of someone who had just run a very long distance, was Harry Potter. Sirius stared. He turned and looked back down the hall as if checking that he hadn't somehow walked into the wrong house. Then he looked back at the cot. Harry had Hagrid. Harry was supposed to be in the air right now, halfway to wherever Dumbledore intended to put him, tucked inside Sirius's motorbike with the wind in his hair. Except he wasn't. He was here, in a cot on Spinner's End with Hermione Granger, both of them breathing, neither of them bleeding, and the ozone smell thick enough to taste. Sirius crossed the room in 3 steps and leaned over the cot rail. Harry's scar was there, pink and raw-looking, shaped like a letter, like a brand, and his face was pale but his chest rose and fell with steady persistence. Hermione was awake and watching Sirius with dark eyes that held far more focus than an 18-month-old had any business having. She didn't cry. She looked at him the way adults sometimes looked at other adults in the moment right after something terrible happened, measuring, checking, deciding whether to trust. Then she looked down at Harry. Then back at Sirius, and she put one small hand very deliberately over Harry's, which was already curled against her side, and kept it there. Sirius sat down on the floor next to the cot with his back against the wall and ran both hands through his wet hair and said very quietly, okay, what the hell? He'd have to think about Peter later. He'd have to think about how Peter had run, and what that meant, and what Sirius was going to do about it when he found him. When, not if, because if there was one certainty left in the wreckage of this night, it was that Peter Pettigrew was not going to walk away from what he'd done. But he'd have to think about that later. Right now there were 2 children in a cot in a dead woman's nursery, and one of them had transporting himself from Godric's Hollow to Bristol in an unexplained act of infant magic, and the other had apparently survived whatever had happened in this house without a scratch, and Sirius Black was the only adult in the building. He reached up and gently, carefully put 2 fingers against Harry's cheek. Harry's eyes opened. Green, Lily's green, exactly and completely, looking up at him without fear. "Hello, mate," Sirius said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Harry blinked. Then he turned and looked at Hermione, then he looked back at Sirius, then he did something that Sirius was going to remember for the rest of his life. He smiled. Not a baby's reflexive smile, not gas or comfort, but a real, small, deliberate smile, the kind that said, I know you and you know me and everything else is details. It was so much like James that Sirius had to look away. He sat on the floor of Emma Granger's nursery, with rain rattling the window and the dark mark fading slowly outside and two children watching him from a cot. And he thought about Dumbledore's plan, which he knew because Dumbledore had talked to all of them in that quiet, heavy way Dumbledore had, about what would happen if the worst came and who would go where and what the Order's responsibilities were. He knew there were blood wards waiting. He knew there was a house in Surrey. He knew there was a woman named Petunia Dursley who had married a man called Vernon, and who Lily had never spoken of without a particular compressed quality around her mouth. He thought about Harry on the floor of a cupboard. He didn't know that's what it would be, he didn't have the foreknowledge for the specific cruelty of it, but he knew Petunia. He'd met her twice at Order functions she hadn't been invited to but had shown up at anyway, with a jaw set so hard you could have used it to sharpen knives, looking at Lily's world with an expression that lived somewhere between hunger and contempt. He knew what people who looked at magic that way did with children who had it. He also thought about what he'd just seen, two children in a cot, one of them who should have been miles away. One small hand placed over another with the deliberate tenderness of someone much older. Sirius took out his wand and sent a Patronus north before he could talk himself out of it. Moony, I'm at the Grangers. Both of them are alive. Come now, don't bring anyone else. The silver dog bounded out through the nursery window and Sirius watched it go, and then he settled back against the wall and waited, and every 30 seconds or so he'd look up at the cot to make sure both children were still breathing. They were. Hermione had fallen asleep by the time Remus arrived, but she'd done it with her hand still over Harry's, and she didn't let go even in sleep, and Harry had turned onto his side so that their foreheads were nearly touching, and the ozone smell hadn't left the room, and Sirius, sitting on the floor with his knees up and his wand across his thighs, had done what he always did when he was waiting somewhere terrible. He counted things. Stars outside the window. Books on the shelf by the door, children's books, a board book about animals and one about shapes and one about letters. He counted the wooden stars on the mobile. He counted his own heartbeats and found them surprisingly steady. Remus came through the front door without knocking, which meant he'd gotten the address from the Patronus and apparated directly, which was sloppy and meant he was frightened. Sirius heard his footsteps on the stairs fast, then slower as he registered the nursery light, and then Remus appeared in the doorway in a too large coat with rainwater on his shoulders and the particular expression he wore when he was working very hard to hold himself together. He looked at the cot. That's Harry, he said. Yeah, Harry was. Hagrid had. I know. Remus stepped into the room slowly, like approaching something wild, and leaned over the cot rail and looked for a long moment. Then he straightened and turned and looked at Sirius with grey eyes that had gone very careful and very bright at the same time. The ozone, he said. That's accidental magic, Sirius said. Something moved him, something here moved him. I think Moony, I don't know how to explain this except to say I think they did it together. Remus looked at the cot again. He was a man who'd spent years reading things that other wizards gave up on, old texts, theoretical magic, the kind of papers published in journals that had print runs of 40 and were mostly purchased by Hogwarts librarians and the obsessives at the Department of Mysteries. He had a very good filing system in his head, and Sirius could see him running through it right now. Soul bonds are theoretical, Remus said carefully. Theoretical. The old magic texts describe them. There are records going back to the founders, a few cases in the 16th century. The last documented instance was Moony. In 1743, a Prowett and a Bones, both of them children when it manifested. They said the first sign was Remus. Sirius got up off the floor, his knees protested. He'd been sitting there for 40 minutes and he was 31 years old and he'd just had the worst night of his life. I know what you're doing. You're filing it so you don't have to feel it yet. I do the same thing sometimes, but I need you to look at me for a second. Remus looked at him. The grief was right there, under the careful voice and the academic reflex right there, enormous and dark, and Sirius felt the echo of it in his own chest because they were both men who had just lost the two people they loved most in the world and had not yet been given permission to fall apart. James is gone, Sirius said. Because it needed to be said to a person who understood what that meant, not to the rubble or the rain or the street. Lily's gone, and I let Hagrid take Harry, and now Harry's here and Hermione Granger is alive and her parents aren't, and I think we have to make a decision right now about what happens next. Because if I don't decide tonight, Dumbledore will decide for me, and I love the man but I'm not. He started again. I'm not sending Harry to Petunia Dursley. Remus was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain had softened to something that was almost gentle. Dumbledore will say the blood wards. Dumbledore can take his blood wards and file them alphabetically. Sirius turned and looked at the cot. Harry transporting himself from Godric's Hollow to this room. To her, he's 1 year old and he already knows where he needs to be. I'm not going to put him somewhere he doesn't need to be. He paused. And she's got nobody now. Her parents are downstairs. She's 18 months old and she's got nobody. Remus sat down on the edge of the small chair by the window, the nursing chair, the one Emma Granger had sat in, the indent still there in the cushion. He sat carefully, like it was important not to disturb something. He looked at the two sleeping children for a long time. "You can't take them both," he said finally. "Not alone. Sirius, you're brilliant, good-looking, responsible. You burned a pot of water last week trying to make tea. That was a gas hob, and I stand by the position that the pilot light was already Sirius." But there was a ghost of something in Remus's voice that hadn't been there 30 seconds ago, something thin and fragile but real. "You can't do it alone." Sirius looked at him steadily. "I know," he said. "That's why I sent for you." The silence that followed was the kind that makes decisions. Sirius could see it happening in Remus's face. The resistance, the reasons, the inventory of everything that made this a terrible idea. The lycanthropy, the poverty, the fact that neither of them had slept in 36 hours and one of them was going to have a full moon in 9 days. All of it was real. None of it was going to stop Remus Lupin, who had loved James Potter and Lily Evans, and who was looking at their son sleeping in a cot next to a little girl who'd lost her parents, and who was fundamentally, structurally incapable of walking away from things that needed protecting. "Where?" Remus said. "Not here, not Godric's Hollow. That's a crime scene and Dumbledore will go back," Sirius thought. He'd been avoiding thinking about Grimmauld Place for years, for all the obvious reasons, but it was large and it was warded and it was his. "Number 12. I know it's a defensible property," Remus said in the voice of a man who was not going to discuss the emotional resonance of the suggestion right now because they did not have the luxury of emotional resonance right now. "It has wards going back 300 years. Yes, okay." He stood up, looked at the cot. "We'll need to." The front door opened downstairs. Not forcefully, not magically. It opened the way doors open when someone knows the house and doesn't feel the need to knock, which meant either a Death Eater with very poor timing or a member of the Order who had gotten there faster than they should have. Both men had their wands up before the footsteps had cleared the bottom stair. Albus Dumbledore appeared in the nursery doorway and he looked tired. Not the theatrical tiredness of a man performing exhaustion, but genuinely deeply tired in a way that made him look older than Sirius had ever seen him. He took in the wands, both pointing at him, and didn't comment on them. He took in the two men standing guard over cot. He took in the two children in the cot, and something moved through his face that Sirius could not entirely read. "Hagrid was quite alarmed," Dumbledore said. His voice was quiet. "When he landed, Harry was gone." "Harry's fine," Sirius said. He did not lower his wand. Dumbledore looked at the cot again. "How did he come to be here?" "We're working on that." "Sirius." Dumbledore's voice had shifted very slightly into the register that usually preceded something profound and sorrowful and completely non-negotiable. Sirius recognized it. He had sat across a desk from it many times. "I understand what you're feeling tonight, what you're both feeling. The loss of James and Lily is don't." Sirius's voice came out very flat. "Don't do that. Don't talk about them like the conversation we're having is about grief management. We can have that conversation in a month. Right now I'm telling you that I am Harry's godfather, legally and magically bound, and I am invoking that right." Dumbledore looked at him, not unkindly. That was the thing about Dumbledore, he was never unkind, which made it harder somehow. "The blood wards Lily created require—" "Lily's dead," Sirius said. The words still felt like stepping off a ledge. "She died tonight creating magic that killed the most powerful dark wizard in living memory. I think she'd prefer we honored her son rather than her blood. That's a simplification of how—" "And the girl," Remus said quietly from by the window. Dumbledore turned to him. "Hermione Granger," Remus said. "Her parents are dead. Her file with the Ministry, she had one flagged as a potential Muggle-born. That's how the Grangers had any contact with the Order at all. It's going to flag her as an orphan in the next 24 hours. What happens to her?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "She would go to family if there is any. If not the Muggle system, she's magical," Remus said. "The Muggle system isn't equipped to—" "We're aware of the challenges. They move together," Sirius said. That stopped Dumbledore. "Sirius, I beg your pardon." "Harry and Hermione. Harry was in Godric's Hollow and she was here and there. Albus, look at them." He gestured at the cot. "Look at how they're lying. That's not coincidence. That's not two children who happen to be in the same house. Something moved Harry across 40 miles of countryside tonight to put him next to her, and it came from both of them." He met Dumbledore's eyes directly. "You know what that is?" Dumbledore looked at the cot for a long time. Long enough that the mobile of wooden stars turned slightly in a draught from the hall. Long enough that Hermione shifted in her sleep and made a small sound, and Harry, without waking, moved fractionally closer to her. When Dumbledore looked away from the cot, something had changed in his expression. The strategic weight of it hadn't gone. Sirius didn't think that weight ever fully left Dumbledore's face, but there was something else there. Something that looked, briefly and uncomplicatedly, like wonder. "That bond, if it is what you believe it is," Dumbledore said slowly, "would be extraordinarily rare. It would also be extraordinarily powerful. The implications for—" "She's not an implication," Sirius said. "She's a child who lost her parents tonight." Another silence. Dumbledore turned and looked out the nursery window at the fading dark mark and the Bristol rooftops and the rain, and Sirius watched his profile and waited, because he'd spent enough years at Order meetings to know that Dumbledore's silences were not empty, they were calculations, and the best thing you could do was let them finish. "The blood wards are not negotiable," Dumbledore said finally. He held up a hand before Sirius could speak. "Not for Harry's permanent residence. I'm not flexible on this point, and the reasons are more complex than I am able to fully explain tonight." He turned. But I am also not a man who ignores evidence before his eyes. If what you are suggesting about these two children is correct, then separating them is not only cruel, it is dangerous." He paused. "What I am able to offer is this. The blood wards require that Harry spend a portion of each year at his mother's blood relations. The summer months would suffice. The rest of the time, he stays with us," Sirius said immediately. Dumbledore looked at him and at Remus and at the two wands that were finally slowly being lowered. "You understand what you are taking on?" "We were Marauders," Remus said. "We have a high tolerance for chaos." Something that was almost a smile crossed Dumbledore's face. "Almost. I will need to speak with the Ministry about guardianship for Miss Granger. It will take time to arrange properly. In the interim, I would ask that you file the appropriate paperwork before anyone else has the opportunity to step in." Sirius, as Harry's godfather, the process is straightforward. "For Miss Granger," he thought for a moment. "Remus, your name was on the emergency contact list. Emma Granger registered with the Order. It was a formality at the time. It may be rather more useful now." Remus blinked. "I didn't know that." Emma Granger was a careful woman. Dumbledore straightened, and the tiredness was back, the real kind, the weight of a long night and longer years. "I will file the initial report with the Ministry tonight and indicate that both children are with known Order members in a secure location. You will have 24 hours before the formal review process begins. I suggest you use them." He moved toward the door, then paused. "And Sirius?" Sirius looked at him. "Peter Pettigrew," Dumbledore said quietly. Something cold ran through Sirius's chest. He'd been not thinking about Peter all night, with the dedication of a man actively holding a door shut against a flood. "He ran," Sirius said. "He did." Dumbledore's voice was measured, careful. "The evidence will suggest otherwise in time. Wormtail is clever and frighten people with nowhere to go become creative." He looked at Sirius steadily. "The Ministry will process things quickly in the wake of tonight. Do not let your anger run faster than your judgment." Then he was gone, and his footsteps descended the stairs, and the front door opened and closed, and Sirius stood in Emma Granger's nursery with the rain on the window and the ozone smell in the air and the two most important children in the wizarding world sleeping 2 feet away from him. He let out a breath that seemed to have been in his chest for several hours. Remus said from the window chair, "I need tea." "Yeah," Sirius said. "And then we need to discuss the practical reality of raising 2 children in Grimmauld Place." "Yeah, I should mention that I have absolutely no idea how to raise a child." "Neither do I." Sirius looked at the cot, but Prongs didn't know either, and Harry turned out all right. His voice snagged slightly on the past tense. He pushed through it. 1 year old and he's already figured out where he belongs. Can't be that different from a dog, can it? You feed it and keep it warm and give it things to chew on. Remus put his face in his hands. "We are going to be terrible at this. We're going to be brilliant at this. Those are not mutually exclusive." But there it was again, that thin, fragile thing in Remus's voice, the one that wasn't quite humor but was adjacent to it, the one that meant "I'm still here, we're still here, there's still something worth being here for." Sirius recognized it because he felt it too, cutting through the grief like a single lit match in a very dark room. He reached over the cot rail and did something he hadn't done yet, something he'd been holding off from, the way you hold off from looking at the thing that's going to break you all the way open. He picked Harry up. Harry woke immediately, blinking, and looked at Sirius with those green eyes, and Sirius held him in the crook of his arm and felt the weight of him, small and warm and entirely real and completely, entirely alive. And the break he'd been holding off finally came, quick and quiet, and he put his face against Harry's hair and didn't say anything for a while. Hermione, alone in the cot now, made a sound, not a cry, more like a question. She pushed herself up and looked around with focused, serious brown eyes, and when she found Harry in Sirius's arms, she seemed to settle slightly, the way a compass needle settles when it finds north. Remus leaned over and lifted Hermione out of the cot with the careful formality of someone who had held very few children and was treating her like she was both precious and possibly volatile. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. He had the same grey eyes that would worry her in years to come, when she was old enough to notice the way exhaustion lived in them. "Hello," he said formally, which was exactly the right approach with Hermione Granger. She considered him. Then she reached up and put her small hand very carefully against his cheek. Remus stood very still for a moment, then swallowed hard and looked away. They stayed in the nursery a while longer than they needed to. Neither of them suggested leaving yet, and neither asked why. "There are rooms you know you're going to want to remember, rooms where something happened that changes the shape of everything after it, and Emma Granger's nursery was one of those rooms, with its board books and its wooden mobile and its crayon drawing on the dresser and the smell of ozone fading slowly from the air. The paperwork took 3 days. Sirius had 2 arguments with the Ministry, one of which involved raising his voice in a waiting room, and one of which involved a strongly worded letter written by Remus, with the particular syntactic precision of a man who had taught defense against the dark arts and knew exactly how to construct a sentence that felt like a warning. By the time the 4th day came, they had legal guardianship of both children, Sirius for Harry, Remus for Hermione, though in practice the distinction was immediately irrelevant because Harry and Hermione refused, collectively and without discussion, to be separated for any meaningful length of time. Grimmauld Place objected loudly to its new occupants. The portrait of Wahlburger Black shrieked the first morning when Sirius came downstairs carrying Harry and singing a song he'd made up on the spot about motorcycles, and she kept shrieking until Sirius threw a curtain over her with enough force to qualify as assault. The house elf creature sulked in corners and muttered, and was eventually persuaded toward something like cooperation by Hermione, who, at 18 months, had apparently already mastered the art of looking at someone with such complete, serious expectation that they felt guilty for disappointing her. The house was large and cold, and full of old black family darkness that would take years to properly deal with. But there was a kitchen with a long table, and a garden with enough space to run in, and a library that made Remus visibly emotional the first time he stood in it, and rooms that could be made warm, and two men who knew a great deal about turning hostile spaces into homes because they'd done it once before in a different castle with a different set of problems. They set up the nursery on the second floor in the room with the best light, 2 cots side by side. Sirius painted the walls himself and got more yellow paint on himself than on the walls, and Remus followed behind him with a wand and fixed everything silently and without comment, except once when he said, "You've painted the window frame," and Sirius said that's a deliberate design choice, and Hermione, sitting on the floor with a board book, looked up at both of them with a very expressive face for an infant. Harry and Hermione slept better when the cots were pushed together. This was established empirically on the second night, when both children had cried for 2 hours straight and Sirius, operating on approximately 6 hours of sleep over 3 days, had shoved the cots together in desperation and been rewarded with immediate profound silence. After that it became standard practice. Neither of them ever articulated the reason. They didn't need to. 3 weeks after the night in Bristol, Remus was sitting in the library working through the third of 7 books on bonded magic that he'd ordered from a specialist dealer in Edinburgh, when Sirius came in and dropped into the chair across from him with 2 mugs of tea, actual tea, successfully made, an achievement that Remus acknowledged with a raised eyebrow. "Tell me something useful," Sirius said. Remus looked up. He had a pencil tucked behind his ear and 3 different colors of ink on his fingers, and the expression of a man who had been piecing together a puzzle for 3 weeks and had just found the corner pieces. The last documented soul bond between 2 magical children manifested in 1743, as I said. Both children were from prominent families. The bond wasn't recognized for what it was until they were in their 4th year at Hogwarts. He glanced at his notes. Before that, the adults around them described it as unusual attachment and possible twin magic, though they weren't related. What does the bond actually do? In the short term, accidental magic amplification, when they're distressed simultaneously or calm simultaneously, the magic reflects back and forth between them and grows. That's what happened the night of he paused. The night the soul bond likely stabilized. Both of them were in danger. Both of them were frightened. The magic pulled Harry across 40 miles of English countryside to put him next to her. Sirius wrapped both hands around his mug. And long-term, Remus turned a page. In documented cases, soul-bonded pairs develop what the texts describe as resonant magic. Their spells interact in ways that create effects neither could produce independently. They can also sense each other's emotional states over distance. The bond it's not love exactly, it's more fundamental than that. It's the sense that another person is part of what you are. Sirius was quiet for a moment. No pressure on either of them then, none whatsoever. Remus looked at him. They're going to need to know eventually what they are to each other. Not tonight. No, Remus agreed. Not for years, but eventually. From upstairs came the sound of something falling over, followed by a cascade of small thumps that suggested a shelf had been breached, followed by laughter, Harry's high and bright and entirely unworried, and then a sound that was unmistakably the heavy thump of an encyclopedia hitting a nursery floor. Sirius was already on his feet. Remus was right behind him. They took the stairs at speed and arrived in the nursery doorway to find that the small bookshelf they'd installed, books being something both children had developed opinions about, even at this age, had somehow come off the wall entirely. It lay on the floor surrounded by scattered board books. Harry was sitting in the middle of the wreckage looking delighted. Hermione was standing by the window with a very specific expression on her face that was at once completely innocent and somehow already unmistakably guilty. Above them, the mobile of wooden stars, not Emma's mobile, a new one Remus had bought shaped like constellations, was spinning, very fast, faster than any draft could account for. The stars blurred into a single ring of light and the ozone smell was back, faint and electric, and when Sirius looked at Harry and Hermione they were looking at each other, and the light from the spinning mobile caught both of their faces, and whatever was passing between them in that moment had nothing to do with language and everything to do with something older. Then Harry laughed again and the shelf jumped back up the wall and reattached itself with a sound like a gunshot, and every book flew back onto it in a different order and the mobile slowed and stopped. Sirius and Remus stood in the doorway in complete silence for several seconds. "I'm going to need a bigger bookcase," Remus said finally. "I'm going to need stronger tea," Sirius said. Harry looked at Hermione. Hermione looked at Harry. Some unspoken thing passed between them, some small, complete children's satisfaction at what they'd done and at who was watching and at the fact that the people watching were clearly going to stay. Hermione sat down next to Harry in the middle of the scattered books. She picked one up and handed it to him. He took it and leaned his head briefly against her shoulder the way he'd leaned his head against her in the cot that first night, that same instinctive certainty. Sirius leaned against the door frame and looked at the two of them and then at Remus and thought, not for the last time and not without grief, and not without the particular terrified joy of being handed something you know you cannot afford to break. James would have loved this. He would have thought this was the best thing that ever happened. He thought he was probably right. Chapter 2. The house on Grimmauld Place smells like books and trouble. 7 years is a long time to become a family. It doesn't happen in a single moment, not in a declaration, not in a ceremony, not even in the kind of crisis that forces people to choose sides. It happens in the accumulation of Tuesday mornings and bad weather and someone burning toast, and someone else knowing exactly how you take your tea without being told. It happens in the repetition of small things until the small things become the structure everything else is built on. By 1989, number 12 Grimmauld Place had been transformed from a cold monument to old prejudice into something that bore only a passing structural resemblance to the house Sirius had grown up in. The portrait of Walburga Black had been moved to the cellar after an incident involving Harry, age 4, who had wandered in front of it with porridge on his chin and made a face back at her that was so perfectly accurate an imitation of her expression that Sirius had laughed so hard he'd knocked a vase off a shelf, which had set Walburga off screaming for 40 minutes, which had made Hermione, who had been trying to read, come out into the hall with a look that could have frozen the Thames. The library had expanded 3 times. Remus was responsible for most of it, but Hermione had strong opinions from the age of 5 onward about organizational systems, and by age 7 she had implemented a cataloguing structure that Remus called somewhat intimidating, and the specialist book dealer in Edinburgh called, frankly, more rigorous than our own. The dealer had said this to Sirius over a fireplace connection, and Sirius had looked at Hermione, who was standing at his elbow listening, and Hermione had nodded once. Like this was simply confirmation of what she'd already established. The kitchen table was the heart of the house. That was where mornings happened, Remus with tea and a book, Sirius with whatever he was currently rebuilding. The motorbike had been replaced 3 times over by now, each iteration more enchanted than the last, Harry eating with the focused intensity of a small person who had many important things to do after breakfast and didn't want to waste time on it. Hermione reading something while also somehow managing to eat and occasionally read aloud particularly interesting passages without pausing for breath. It was loud and warm and perpetually slightly disorganized, and it was the best home either child had ever had, which was both wonderful and something the adults tried not to think about too directly. The September morning that this particular chapter begins on was a Monday, which was when Remus taught them formally. Sirius taught them on Thursdays, with a curriculum that Remus reviewed beforehand and occasionally edited with a red pen, and it was raining, which in London in September was less a weather event and more a philosophical position the sky had committed to. Harry was at the kitchen table with a piece of parchment and a Muggle pencil, because Remus had opinions about fine motor development and ink control before quills were introduced. He was supposed to be working on a maths problem. Instead he was drawing something that was either a dragon or a dog. It was genuinely unclear, with total absorption and no apparent awareness that the maths problem existed. Hermione was at the other end of the table with 4 books open simultaneously and a piece of parchment covered in neat, small writing. She was 9 years old, and she wrote with the confident, rapid penmanship of someone who'd been using it as a primary form of expression since she was 5. One of the books was a standard arithmetic text. 2 others were historical, 1 magical and 1 Muggle. She had a habit of reading parallel histories simultaneously, comparing them, making notes in the margins about discrepancies. The 4th was a novel she was reading for pleasure and had been trying to hide under the table because Remus would give her a look about it. Remus was at the stove. He made the best scrambled eggs of anyone Sirius had ever met, which was a specific and surprising talent, and he was making them now with one hand while reading a letter in the other, and his expression had done the thing where it went very still and focused in a way that meant the letter was from someone official. Sirius came down the stairs at 8:20 doing 3 things simultaneously, buttoning his shirt, holding a piece of toast in his teeth, and carrying a small brass gear that was apparently important to whatever project currently occupied his workbench. He sat down, removed the toast from his mouth, and looked at Remus. "Who's writing to you before 9 in the morning on a Monday?" "Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures," Remus said, setting the letter down on the counter with the careful neutrality of a man who has had a lot of practice at being careful and neutral. Sirius set down the gear. His face did something complicated. About the usual, Remus turned back to the eggs. Registration requirements, a new clause in the werewolf registry legislation. There's a proposed amendment that would, he stopped. It's not urgent, Remus. It's not urgent, Remus said again more quietly. Harry looked up from his drawing. He had an instinct for shifts in tone that Sirius privately thought came from two sources, the Marauder blood because James had the same instinct, and the bond because Hermione's version of the same instinct expressed itself differently but was equally acute. What's wrong? He said. Nothing's wrong, Remus said. You've got the letter face, Harry said. I don't have a letter face. You've absolutely got a letter face, Hermione said without looking up from her books. Your jaw goes tight on the left side and you stop making eye contact. You've had it 3 times this month. Remus turned from the stove and looked at Hermione with an expression that balanced somewhere between exasperation and something that looked uncomfortably like pride. I am raising you to be perceptive, he said. I should have thought more carefully about what that would look like in practice. You should have, Hermione agreed. She looked up now and her dark eyes were direct and steady in the way they always were when she decided something was worth paying attention to. Is it going to change anything for us, the amendment? The question was so practical, so clean, cutting straight through to what actually mattered, that Sirius had to take a very focused sip of tea to hide what his face was doing. No, Remus said. And then because lying to Hermione had never actually worked and didn't improve with repetition, not immediately, we may need to have some conversations about disclosure requirements eventually, but not now. Hermione looked at him for another moment, then nodded and went back to her books. Not dismissively, she'd registered it, filed it, would return to it later. Harry, across the table, had gone back to his dragon or dog. But his pencil moved slower for a few seconds and Sirius noticed, because Sirius always noticed Harry's small recalibrations. Right, Sirius said, pushing back from the table and picking up his toast. Moony, give me the letter after breakfast, we'll deal with it. He looked around the table. What's on the curriculum today? History of the Goblin Rebellions, Remus said, putting eggs on 4 plates with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd made 4 plates of eggs every morning for years. And Hermione, I saw the novel under the table. It's historically relevant, Hermione said immediately. It's Treasure Island. There are themes of colonialism and resource extraction that are directly, you can read it after your Goblin Rebellions essay, Remus said, setting her plate down. Which I expect to be at least 2 feet and not this time 4 feet, because last week's history of magic response was 4.5 feet and you started to repeat yourself in the 3rd foot. Hermione looked briefly, genuinely offended. I did not repeat myself. You made the same point about Burdock Muldoon's legislative failures 3 times with different vocabulary. That's called emphasis. It's called word count inflation, 2 feet. But Remus was smiling slightly at his own plate, not looking at her, and Hermione subsided with the grace of someone who recognized that this particular argument was not going anywhere and had better battles to choose. Harry, who had been watching this exchange with the bright attention he gave anything involving the natural sparring between Remus and Hermione, which he enjoyed the way some people enjoy watching a very good tennis match, caught Sirius's eye across the table. Sirius made a barely perceptible face. Harry pressed his lips together to keep from grinning. This was another thing about living with someone for 7 years. The whole language of it, not spoken, not even gestured, just there, a continuous low-frequency current of mutual recognition that operated below the level of thought. Sirius and Harry had it. Remus and Hermione had it. The 4 of them had a version of it together. And then there was the thing between Harry and Hermione, which was its own frequency entirely, operating on a channel the adults could observe but couldn't quite access. Lessons happened in the library because the library was the best room in the house for serious work, and also because Hermione had campaigned for this so persistently at age 6 that Remus had eventually just moved the lesson table in there and accepted defeat. The Goblin Rebellions went well, in the sense that Hermione had already read the primary source documents and Harry had not, but compensated by asking questions that were so specific and pointed that they derailed the formal lesson into a 40-minute conversation about whether Ragnarok the First had been technically justified in his grievances, which was not the lesson plan but was, in Remus's private assessment, the better lesson. Harry had a gift for this, for finding the human story inside the historical one. He didn't read as much as Hermione, had never read as much as Hermione, but what he retained he kept in an accessible and usable way, and his instinct for the emotional logic of a situation was almost uncanny. Where Hermione built arguments structurally, premise by premise, Harry went straight to the thing underneath the argument, the thing that actually made people act. Together they were extraordinarily difficult to outthink, because they approached problems from angles that complemented each other so completely that there were almost no gaps. Sirius watched them argue about Ragnarok, Hermione citing specific treaty violations from a book she'd pulled off the shelf, Harry countering with what Ragnarok would have felt when he saw the sword, his instinct for motivation turning an abstract historical grievance into something immediate and present, and thought, not for the first time, Dumbledore is right to be paying attention to these two. It wasn't a comfortable thought. Dumbledore's attention was, in Sirius's experience, Accurate and caring and also fundamentally instrumental, and the combination made it something you wanted to accept with both hands and also keep at arm's length. He pushed the thought away. Outside the library window, the rain had graduated to something theatrical, running in sheets down the glass, and somewhere in the house, a window that hadn't been properly latched was banging rhythmically, and it was a good morning for being inside with people you loved and arguments about goblin history. The explosion happened at 11:43, not a real explosion, no heat, no structural damage, nothing broken except the quiet. What happened was this. Hermione reached for a book on the top shelf, a reference book on European wizarding history that lived at the edge of her reach even when she stood on the second rung of the library ladder, and lost her grip on the ladder at the same moment she lost her grip on the book, and for a fraction of a second she was genuinely falling, nothing between her and the hard library floor. She didn't hit the floor. What happened instead was that every book in a 6-foot radius of the ladder left its shelf simultaneously, not throwing itself, rising smoothly the way objects move in dreams, and arranging itself in the air in a dense cushioned cluster that was, in physical terms, exactly the right shape to catch a falling 9-year-old. Hermione landed in it as if it had been placed there deliberately, which it had in a sense, just not by anyone who'd thought about it consciously. Harry was across the room. He hadn't looked up from his work when she grabbed for the shelf. He hadn't said anything. He was now sitting very still with both hands flat on the table and his pencil rolling away from fingers that had gone loose, and he was staring at the middle distance with an expression that looked more surprised than anything else, the expression of someone who has just discovered they did something without knowing they were going to do it. The floating books settled Hermione gently onto the library floor and then returned to their shelves in the correct order. She stood up, brushed down her jumper and looked at the shelves for a moment. Then she looked at Harry. Her expression was harder to read, not frightened, not exactly, but alert in a full-body way. Her attention narrowed to a single point. Sirius was in the doorway before the last book reshelved. He had his wand in his hand through pure reflex, and he put it away immediately because there was nothing to hex, which was somehow more disorienting than the alternative would have been. Remus appeared at his shoulder a second later. "That was bigger than last time," Remus said quietly. Sirius looked at Harry, who still hadn't moved. "Has you all right?" Harry looked at his hands. "I didn't mean to. I know. She was falling and He turned his hands over, looking at the palms. "It was like reaching, except not with my hands." Hermione had crossed the room and sat down in the chair next to Harry with the directness of someone who knows exactly where they need to be. She looked at his face rather than his hands. "Does it feel like it's running away from you?" she asked. Her voice was steady and practical, and Sirius recognized in it the same tone Remus used when he was being careful. "The way the bookcase did when we were in the nursery, when we were small." Harry thought about it with the genuine consideration he gave to serious questions. "No," he said, "it doesn't feel out of control. It feels like me, like I did it." He paused. "I just didn't know I was going to." "Reflex," Hermione said. "Accidental magic is always reflex when you're young. It's subconscious intention, not random discharge. You didn't accidentally move the books, you specifically moved them to catch me. That's directional." "That's actually quite sophisticated." Harry looked at her. "You're analyzing the thing that just happened." "I'm always analyzing things. You were just falling, and now I'm not falling, so I can analyze." Harry looked at her for a moment longer, and then something in his face relaxed, the tightly coiled surprise unwinding into something calmer. He picked up his pencil, then he set it down again. "You weren't scared," he said. "It wasn't quite a question." Hermione considered. "Not once the books were there." She paused. "I knew you'd catch me." The room was very quiet for a moment. Sirius and Remus in the doorway did not look at each other, but were each acutely aware of the other's presence in the way you are when you're both feeling the same thing and have agreed wordlessly not to say it aloud. "Right," Remus said, stepping into the room with the brisk energy of a man deciding to be functional. "I think the goblin rebellions can wait until after lunch. I'd like to run a few diagnostics, if that's all right with both of you. Nothing invasive, a basic episky pattern to check for any magical overextension, and a resonance mapping if you're willing." "What's resonance mapping?" Harry asked. "It measures how two magical signatures interact. I've been wanting to do it properly for a while." Remus's voice was careful and professional, and only someone who knew him well could hear the undercurrent of, "and today has given me a much better reason to do it than anything I could have planned." Hermione was already interested. "The papers you've been reading about bonded magic," she said, not a question. Remus sat down across from both of them. "Yes, you've been reading those for 7 years," Hermione said. "Since we were babies, you've been tracking something." "I have." She looked at him steadily. "Tell us what you know." Sirius leaned against the bookshelf and folded his arms and watched Remus make the decision he'd been building toward for years. It wasn't hard to read, the small exhale, the way he set his hands flat on the table, the particular quality of attention he focused on both children at once. "I'll tell you what I believe," Remus said, "because it's important to distinguish between what the evidence suggests and what can be stated as fact. What I believe is this: the two of you share a magical bond that is extraordinarily rare and extremely old. The texts call it a soul bond, which is a dramatic name for something that is, at its core, simply a deep and permanent resonance between two magical signatures that are, for lack of a better word, harmonically matched. Two instruments in permanent perfect tune. He looked from Hermione to Harry and back. The night your parents died, both sets of parents, something happened that allowed the bond to stabilize earlier than it might otherwise have. Harry was drawn across 40 miles of England to be next to you, Hermione, not by a spell, not by anyone's intention, by the bond itself, because you were both in danger and the bond responded. Harry was very still, not the paralyzed stillness of shock, but the concentrated stillness of someone absorbing information carefully. What does it mean for us? It means your magic will continue to amplify each other, and that amplification will grow as you get older and your individual magic develops. It means that in moments of strong emotion, fear, anger, protectiveness, you may act instinctively through the bond before you consciously intend to. He nodded toward the bookshelves. As you just demonstrated. He paused. It also means that you will likely develop a sensitivity to each other's emotional states that most people don't have with anyone. I already know when she's upset, Harry said, even when she doesn't look it. Yes, and I know things about him, Hermione said more slowly, like she was being precise about something she'd had private thoughts about for a while. Not exactly what he's thinking, more like the shape of what he's thinking, the temperature of it. Remus nodded. That will strengthen over time. It will also be something you learn to modulate because you'll both need privacy as you get older, and the bond will respect that if you're deliberate about it. He folded his hands. The most important thing I want you to understand is this: the bond isn't something that's happening to you, it's something that's part of you. You don't have to manage it or contain it or be afraid of it, you just have to grow into it. Another quiet. The rain was still doing its theatrical thing against the windows. Somewhere below, the unfastened window had finally stopped banging, presumably because the wind had shifted. You've known since we were babies, Harry said. There was no accusation in it, his voice was simply thoughtful. But he looked at both Sirius and Remus with the directness that had been one of his defining qualities from about age 3 onward, the look that said, I am going to understand this and you might as well help me. We suspected, Sirius said. Mooney's been building the evidence. Why didn't you tell us sooner? Because you were children, Remus said. And because the knowledge of a thing changes your relationship to it, and we wanted you to. We wanted the bond to be something you grew with naturally, not something you were given a framework for before you were ready for the framework. Harry thought about that. Then he looked at Hermione. Did you already know? Hermione was quiet for a moment. I knew something, she said carefully. I didn't have words for it. The same way you don't have words for knowing that a room is warm, you don't analyze it, it's just true. Harry nodded. Then in the way he had of shifting gears without warning, can I ask something else? Always, Sirius said. The people who are after us. He said it simply, without drama, with the particular matter-of-fact quality that made Sirius want to both applaud and sit down in anguish simultaneously. The ones from that night, are any of them still out there? The shift in the room was subtle but complete. 7 years of careful conversations, of managing information, of answering questions honestly without volunteering more than the age-appropriate amount, and Harry had just stepped cleanly over whatever line they'd been drawing. Sirius unfolded his arms. He looked at Remus. Remus looked at him. They had this conversation without speaking, the way long-standing partners do, and it took approximately 2 seconds and ended with the shared acknowledgement that there was no version of the answer to this question that made sense to withhold any longer. Voldemort was defeated the night he killed your parents, Sirius said. Defeated but not destroyed. There are people who believe he'll come back. Do you believe he'll come back? Hermione asked. Yes, Sirius said. Remus made a slight movement, not disagreement, more like the flinch of someone who wished the honest answer were different. I do, not soon, but eventually. And Peter Pettigrew, Harry said. The name sat in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Sirius looked at Harry carefully. You know that name? I found one of Remus's notebooks, Harry said, with a combination of total directness and absolutely no apology that was so purely James Potter that Sirius had to breathe through it. 2 years ago, the one with the brown cover, I read the first section before I understood what it was about, and then I put it back. Remus closed his eyes briefly. The brown cover, he said, not the grey one. The grey one was all werewolf research. I put that back immediately, Harry said, and something in the way he said it, so careful about Remus's privacy, so deliberate about the line he hadn't crossed, made Remus open his eyes and look at Harry with an expression that didn't have a clean word. Peter Pettigrew was our friend, Sirius said, and he betrayed your parents to Voldemort. He ran afterward, and the Ministry thinks he's dead, and I know he isn't, and I will find him. He said the last part with a quietness that was much colder than anger. Not now, not for years maybe, but I will find him. Harry nodded once. Okay, he said, then, I'm glad you didn't go after him that night. Instead of, he stopped and looked at Hermione and finished the sentence not with words but with the slight movement of his shoulder toward her that meant instead of staying. Something happened in Hermione's face then, quick, warm and instantly controlled, and she looked at her books rather than at Harry. Sirius had the extremely unusual experience of feeling like he should leave the room, which was a feeling he was not accustomed to and which confirmed several things he'd been quietly tracking for about a year. Right, he said, with the decisive energy of a man changing the subject before it gets away from him. Lunch. After which, diagnostics, and then the afternoon is yours. The rain looks like it's thinking about stopping. It's November, Remus said. The rain is never thinking about stopping. Optimism, Mooney. Meteorology Padfoot. Harry and Hermione came out of whatever private adjustment they'd both been making, and the moment settled back into the ordinary texture of Monday in the library, and Sirius collected himself and went to make sandwiches. The diagnostics that afternoon confirmed what Remus had suspected in broad terms and exceeded his expectations in specific ones. The resonance mapping showed the two magical signatures weaving around each other in patterns that Remus stared at for a long time with his pencil moving quickly across a fresh page. Harry's magic was warm and kinetic, all movement and instinct, like light that travels in straight lines until it needs to bend. Hermione's was denser, more structured, not rigid but deliberate, precise the way crystal is precise, built from intention outward. Where they touched, and they touched constantly, in a low-level background hum that Remus could map but not quantify, the combination was genuinely startling, not just addition. Something more like a multiplier, except that wasn't quite right either because it wasn't random amplification. It was enhancement that reflected the best of each, Harry's intuition becoming sharper, Hermione's precision becoming more fluid, both signatures gaining a depth and warmth that neither had fully developed alone. Remus sat back from his work and wrote, in small letters at the bottom of the page, "By Hogwarts they will be formidable. By 5th year they will be unlike anything the school has seen in a generation. By the time they're adults, the right question is not what they can do, the right question is what they'll choose to do with it." He underlined the last sentence twice. After dinner, chicken and roast potatoes, Harry's request, which he made every third week with the reliable conviction of someone who has found something good and sees no reason to vary it. The four of them ended up in the sitting room in a loose, comfortable formation that had evolved naturally over years. Remus in the chair by the window with his book, Sirius on the floor with the brass gear and several others, having migrated from the workbench under the theory that the sitting room fire was better, Harry on the sofa with his legs tucked under him working on the drawing from breakfast which had been resolved firmly into a dragon, and Hermione at the low table with Treasure Island, which she'd earned by completing a 2-foot essay on the Goblin rebellions in the time between diagnostics and dinner. Which was an unreasonable achievement that nobody mentioned, because drawing attention to it would only encourage her. The fire was good. The rain had given up its theatrical ambitions and settled into a steady, unremarkable drizzle. Creature had been prevailed upon to bring biscuits and had done so with the martyred expression he brought to all domestic tasks, and they were on the low table next to Hermione, who was eating them without looking up. Harry finished his dragon and looked at it for a moment and then leaned over and held it up. "Moony," Remus looked up from his book, "is the Goblin Rebellion's essay the only required reading before Hogwarts, like the actual official list?" "Formally speaking, yes. Practically speaking, you should both be able to name every Hogwarts professor, the basic structure of the curriculum, the 4 houses and their characteristics, and the broad outlines of magical law applicable to underage wizards." "We know all that," Harry said. "You know all that," Remus agreed. "I'm confirming that the official requirements are below your current level, since you seem to be asking whether you need to do more preparation. I'm asking if there's anything we don't know that we should." He said it differently from the way most 9-year-olds would say it, not with anxiety, not with competitive urgency, but with a genuine, quiet interest in identifying real gaps. "Practical spell work, but that's what first year is for," Remus said. "You'll have wands by the end of next year's shopping trip and then we'll begin foundational casting. There's no advantage in rushing that." "What about Quidditch?" Sirius said from the floor. "Sirius," Remus said, "it's a legitimate subject area. It's not on any approved curriculum." "It should be." Sirius looked at Harry. "Your father was the best Quidditch player Gryffindor produced in a decade, potentially 2. Your mother said that was a biased assessment because she was also an exceptional chaser but didn't play because she was busy being right about everything else." Harry grinned. He loved these moments, the small, offered pieces of his parents. He never pushed for them. He waited for them the way you wait for something you've learned not to demand. "Mum played," he said. "Could have played. Your grandmother played. The Potters were a Quidditch family. Your mum preferred to demonstrate that she didn't need to be good at a sport to be more impressive than everyone who was." Sirius paused. "She was right, it was annoying. You could have told me you loved her," Remus said mildly, turning a page. "I did love her, she terrified me for a different reason." "What reason?" Harry asked. Sirius considered. "Because she saw through everything, every time, with no effort. You'd think you'd gotten away with something and you'd catch her looking at you with this expression like she was watching someone make a mistake in slow motion and had decided not to intervene because the lesson would be better that way." He looked at Harry. "Hermione has that expression sometimes." Harry looked at Hermione. Hermione looked up from her book. "I'm not doing it right now." "But you were thinking about doing it," Harry said. "I was thinking that it's interesting how often Sirius's stories about your mother involve him being outsmarted." "In a loving way," Sirius said. "Obviously." Hermione went back to her book, but the corner of her mouth had moved, and Harry looked back at his dragon drawing with a similar expression, and Sirius looked at Remus with the tired warmth of a man who has long since accepted that the 2 people he's raising are smarter than him, and has decided to find it pleasing rather than threatening. The fire popped and settled. The drizzle on the windows was very steady and very quiet. 2 more years, Hermione said to nobody in particular, turning a page. Of what? Harry asked. Before Hogwarts. She said it without looking up, but her voice had a quality in it that was different from her ordinary thinking out loud tone. 2 more years here, then everything changes. The room was quiet for a moment. Not everything, Harry said. His voice was entirely certain, the way his voice got when he decided something was true. Hermione looked up. She looked at him, then at Sirius and Remus, then back at Harry. Whatever she was reading in his face seemed to be the answer she'd actually been looking for. She nodded once and went back to her book. Harry went back to his dragon. Sirius set down the gear and picked up his tea and thought about Dumbledore's next visit, which was scheduled for Thursday, and about the conversation they'd have about Hogwarts and wards and Harry's celebrity, and the 1,000 complications that 2 years had once seemed like a comfortable distance from and were now sitting much closer. He thought about Peter, somewhere in the world, having escaped the consequences of what he'd done for 8 years. He thought about Voldemort, reduced and scattered and waiting in whatever dark place unfinished things waited, and about the 2 children in this sitting room who would one day be the clearest answer to that waiting. He thought about the fact that they'd had 7 years. 7 years of Tuesday mornings and burned toast and library arguments and the sitting room fire. 7 years of building the thing that mattered. He thought that might actually be enough. Not to make them safe, nothing could make them safe, he wasn't delusional about that, but enough to make them ready. Enough to make them theirs fully, irreducibly themselves, loved well and shaped by love into something that couldn't be unmade. From the table, Hermione reached out without looking and took the last biscuit. Harry across the room and 3 seconds later looked up with the expression of someone who has just registered a loss. He looked at the empty plate. He looked at Hermione. Hermione turned a page. I wasn't going to eat that, Harry said. I know, Hermione said. Then why? Because knowing you weren't going to eat it and having the option to eat it are different things. She looked up. Now you've had the experience of wanting a biscuit when there were no biscuits, which is a more common life condition than having a biscuit whenever you want one. You ate my biscuit to teach me about scarcity. I ate your biscuit because I wanted it. She paused. The lesson on scarcity is incidental but valid. Harry stared at her. Sirius buried his face in his mug. Remus had gone entirely still in the way that meant he was physically preventing himself from laughing because laughing would undermine the lesson. Moony, Harry said with great dignity. She did it again. I heard, Remus said. You're not going to do anything about it. No, Remus agreed, I'm not. Harry looked at the ceiling with the expression of a person surrounded by people who were united against him, then looked at Hermione, who was reading with the serene composure of someone who had no regrets. He held the look for a second, and then quietly, helplessly, in the way that some things simply are true, he grinned. Hermione turned a page and did not look up and smiled. Outside, the rain on Grimmauld Place settled into its long November patience, and inside the light was warm, and in 2 more years everything would change. And right now there were 4 people in a sitting room and a fire burning low and biscuits that were gone, and it was enough. For now it was more than enough. Chapter 3. Hogwarts wasn't ready. The Hogwarts Express left at 11, which meant leaving Grimmauld Place at 9:30, which meant Sirius was awake at 7 doing something loud in the kitchen that he claimed was breakfast preparation, and that Remus, coming downstairs at 7:15, identified immediately as anxiety given physical form. You're making pancakes, Remus said. I'm making a proper send-off breakfast. You've made 4 batches. The first 3 weren't right. Remus looked at the stack of pancakes on the counter, which was genuinely impressive in its height, and then at Sirius, who was standing at the stove with his sleeves rolled up and his hair doing several things at once, and the expression of a man who had not slept particularly well. He picked up the kettle and filled it without comment. Harry came down at 7:30 in school robes that were slightly too long. They'd bought them in August and he'd grown since, which was its own small indignity, with his trunk already packed and shrunk to pocket size and his Nimbus 2000 under his arm. He was 11 years old and he looked, to Sirius's eye, startlingly like James had looked at 11, except for the eyes, which were entirely Lily's, and also for a quality of self-possession that was neither James nor Lily but simply Harry, built from 7 years of being loved and allowed to become himself. He sat down at the table and looked at the pancake stack. How many did he make? Many, Remus said. Is he all right? He will be when you come back at Christmas. Remus set down 2 mugs and looked at Harry with the quiet attention he brought to things that mattered. Are you all right? Harry considered the question with his usual genuine care. Yeah, he said. I'm ready. You're not nervous, a bit, but the excited kind. He picked up his mug. Is that wrong? It's exactly right, Remus said. Hermione arrived at 7:45 in robes that fit perfectly because she'd insisted on a second fitting in September and had been correct that the first fitting's measurements were slightly off at the shoulders. Her trunk was also packed, also shrunk, and she had a bag over her shoulder containing 3 books she determined were necessary for the journey, a notebook and 2 pencils because she'd lost a pencil on the night bus once and considered it a lesson in redundancy. She sat down across from Harry. She looked at the pancake stack. She looked at Sirius, who was now making a 5th batch. She looked at Harry. He's been up since 6, Harry said. I know, she said. I heard him at 5:30. Sirius put a plate of pancakes down in front of both of them with the decisive energy of a man who has been useful and knows it. He sat down, picked up his tea, and then did what he never did at breakfast. He just looked at them, not saying anything. Just looking at them with the unguarded expression of someone who has gotten something very right and is allowing himself one moment to know it. "You're being sentimental," Hermione said. "I'm eating my tea. You haven't touched your tea in 3 minutes. I'm being dramatic about eating my tea." "Sirius," Harry said gently. Sirius looked at him. "We'll right," Harry said. Something moved across Sirius's face. He nodded once quickly and picked up his tea. "I know," he said. "Right, pancakes. Let's talk about important things, like the fact that Gryffindor haven't won the Quidditch Cup in 3 years and that is about to change." "I might not make the team first year," Harry said. "You will make the team first year. First years don't usually. You will make the team first year," Sirius said, with the absolute certainty of a man who had watched Harry on a borrowed broomstick since age 5 and knew exactly what he was looking at. "The question is whether the current Gryffindor captain is smart enough to see it." Remus sat down. "The current Gryffindor captain is Oliver Wood," he said, "who by all accounts would attempt to recruit a lamppost if it showed sufficient quickness." "Good," Sirius said. "Then we are fine." Platform 9 3/4 was exactly as loud and warm and impossibly busy as everything Sirius had described. Steam from the Scarlet engine hung in the cold September air, and families moved in every direction, and owls complained from their cages, and someone's cauldron had rolled off a trolley and was being pursued down the platform by a red-haired boy who looked harassed. Harry and Hermione moved through it with their trunks, enlarged again now, and Sirius and Remus flanked them in the way they had of occupying space deliberately, not protectively exactly, more like people who are comfortable with their own presence and expect the world to make room. People recognized Harry. Sirius had warned them about this, had been warning Harry specifically for 2 years with the care of a man who understood that celebrity bestowed without consent is a peculiar cruelty. The looks started on the platform, people who knew the Scar, who whispered after he'd passed, who did double takes with an intensity that was not unfamiliar but that hit differently at 11 with a trunk and a letter and the actual Hogwarts Express standing right there. Harry noticed. Of course he noticed everything, but he didn't shrink from it. He met one woman stare directly and she looked away first, which Sirius registered with quiet, fierce satisfaction. "They're going to do that a lot," Harry said, not bothering to lower his voice. "They are," Sirius agreed. "It's going to get boring, faster than you'd think." Hermione, beside him, had clocked 3 separate stares and 2 whispered conversations in the last 30 seconds. She said nothing but moved a half-step closer to Harry in a way that looked entirely casual. At the train door, Sirius pulled Harry into a hug that was brief and fierce and left Harry's robe slightly disheveled, and then Remus put both hands on Harry's shoulders and looked at him the way he sometimes did, like a man checking that everything he'd built was still there, and said simply, "Owl, if you need anything, for any reason." "I will," Harry said. Then Remus turned to Hermione, and there was always a slightly different quality to this moment between them, because Hermione had been Remus's to look after since she was 18 months old, and she was precise and capable and completely fine, and he still sometimes had to work quite hard not to show how much she mattered to him in a way that might embarrass both of them. He settled for tucking a strand of hair back from her face in a gesture so quick and so practiced that it didn't leave room for awkwardness and said, "You've read all the textbooks." 3 times, she said. "Then you're prepared." "I know I'm prepared." She paused. "That's not actually what I'm thinking about." "What are you thinking about?" She glanced at Harry, who had taken 2 steps up toward the train door and turned back to wait. "Whether Hogwarts will be what we imagined," she said. "Or something different." Remus looked at her with his steady grey eyes. "Probably both," he said. "That's generally how it works." She nodded like this was the answer she'd expected and had needed confirmed, and then she picked up her bag and went up to where Harry was waiting, and they got on the train together, and Sirius and Remus stood on the platform and watched the window until 2 faces appeared in it, Harry's hand raised, Hermione beside him with a smaller wave, and the train began to move. Sirius put his hands in his pockets. Remus stood next to him. The platform cleared around them as the express gathered speed. "Right," Sirius said after a moment. "Right," Remus agreed. "Pub, it's 9:40 in the morning. Tea then?" "Yes," Remus said. "Tea." The compartment they found was at the back of the train, quiet enough for the journey, and held one other occupant when they arrived, a red-haired, freckled boy sitting alone with a slightly lost expression and a chair set on the seat beside him. He looked up when they appeared in the doorway and said, "Oh, do you mind? Everything else is full or has Neville Longbottom's toad in it, and Trevor keeps escaping and nobody's sure why." "We don't mind," Harry said, and they put their things up and sat down, and the boy said his name was Ron Weasley and that his brothers were Fred and George and Percy, all of whom were at Hogwarts already in various years, and the information came out in the slightly tumbling way of someone who is nervous and talking to fill space. Harry liked him immediately, which Hermione noted and logged. She liked him too. He was direct and funny and not, she noticed, saying anything about Harry's scar, which the entire rest of the platform had found irresistible. Ron had looked at it once, registered it, and moved on in the way that suggested he came from a family that had been living in the magical world long enough for the war to be not a legend but a weight. The trolley came and Ron's expression did something complicated and quickly suppressed, and Harry bought enough for all three of them without making it a point, just quietly ensuring there was enough, in the way you did when you'd been raised by people who understood the difference between generosity and charity. They talked Quidditch. Ron was passionate and specific and knew statistics going back 20 years, and Harry matched him, and Hermione listened and occasionally corrected a date, which Ron initially seemed surprised by and then quickly accepted as simply part of how Hermione worked. They talked houses, and Ron said obviously Gryffindor, and Harry agreed, and Hermione said that Gryffindor seemed the most probable fit, but she had considered all four houses seriously before arriving at the same conclusion. Ron looked at her. "You've thought about all four houses?" "Extensively. There are strengths in each." She looked back at him over her book, "though I think the qualities being sorted for are more complex than the founding mythology suggests. The hat has to have developed significant nuance over 1,000 years." Ron opened his mouth, closed it, said, "You're going to be terrifying at exams, aren't you?" "Probably," Hermione said entirely without apology, and turned a page. Harry caught Ron's eye, and they shared the particular look of two people who have just understood that they are dealing with a natural force rather than a person and are choosing to find it pleasing. Ron grinned first. Harry grinned second. "She's always been like this," Harry said. "Good," Ron said with the decisive simplicity that was Harry would learn one of his best qualities. The sorting was exactly what Remus had described structurally: an old hat, a long bench, names called alphabetically, and nothing at all like what he'd described emotionally. Standing in the line of first years in the great hall with the enchanted ceiling showing a thick September night overhead, and four long tables full of students and the professors at the high table watching, Harry felt something he hadn't quite felt before. Not nerves, something more like recognition, like arriving somewhere you've known about for a long time and finding it more real than you expected. The hat talked to him. This was the part none of the books had properly conveyed, not just the talking but the quality of it, the sense of something enormous and patient sitting in your thoughts like a person reading through a library with all the time in the world. "Harry Potter," the hat said in a voice that wasn't quite a voice. "Yes, I've been waiting to see you for some time. You have quite a bit going on in here, don't you?" Harry thought with some precision. "Gryffindor, you could be, certainly. Bravery, yes, genuine, not the performed kind. Loyalty, obviously, but that mind of yours, the speed of it, Ravenclaw would suit you. And the ambition, the drive, it's there, Potter, don't argue," Harry thought with considerably more precision. "Gryffindor, where the others are." A pause, something in the hat's presence that felt almost amused. "The bond," it said. "Yes, I see it. I've sorted bonded pairs before, not often, never quite like this." Another pause, longer. "Are you sure?" "Not because you have to be, but because you—" "Yes," Harry thought, "I'm sure." "Gryffindor," the hat announced, and the table on the left erupted, and Harry walked to it with the clean certainty of someone who has made the right choice. Hermione Granger was 3 names before him in the alphabet and had been sorted before Harry. The hat had been on her head for 4 seconds. 4 seconds, and then, Gryffindor. She was already at the table when Harry arrived. He sat down next to her, and she gave him a look that said obviously, and he gave her a look that said obviously, and around them Gryffindor celebrated, and Ron landed next to Harry a few minutes later with the explosive relief of a boy who had grown up in a family of lions and had not seriously considered any other outcome but had been worried nonetheless. The feast was extraordinary. Harry ate with more genuine pleasure than he could easily account for. The food was good, yes, but it was more than that. It was the accumulated reality of a place he'd known about since he was old enough to read, and was now actually, physically, undeniably inside. Hermione read the enchanted ceiling for a few minutes with pure, unfiltered wonder before catching herself and returning to conversation with the expression of someone who had permitted one moment of uncomplicated awe and was now ready to be analytical again. "The ceiling charm is continuous," she told Harry and Ron. "Someone has to maintain it. I wonder if it's automated or if there's a dedicated—" "Hermione," Harry said. "What? Eat first." "I'm eating." "You're eating and analyzing." "Just eat for a few minutes." She looked at him. He looked back. She ate for 3 minutes without analyzing anything, which was, Harry was privately certain, the longest she'd managed in her life. Potions was Professor Snape, who was tall and pale and moved like a closed door and looked at Harry on the first day of term with an expression that Harry read in about half a second. He'd been warned. Sirius had been surprisingly careful about this, actually. Had said Snape hated your father and your father gave him reasons but not enough reasons, and that's a complicated thing and I haven't fully worked out how to feel about it myself, but he's going to take it out on you and you need to be prepared for that without letting it make you cruel, because you're better than that, and so eventually was James. Harry had sat with that for a while and come to his own conclusions. Snape asked him questions on the first day, rapid, designed to humiliate. The entire Slytherin half of the dungeon class watched with undisguised anticipation. Harry answered every question correctly, clearly, and without inflection, and looked at Snape the entire time with the steady, unimpressed gaze of a boy who had been raised by a man who'd survived Azkaban in his own head by knowing exactly who he was. and who had therefore learned early that the goal of intimidation was to make you doubt yourself, and who simply didn't. Snape couldn't find fault with the answers. He gave Harry 1 point for the last one with the graceless brevity of a man paying a debt and moved on, and the Slytherins looked vaguely cheated. In the corridor after class, Hermione said, "You knew the Bezoar answer already." "Remus did a unit on antidotes last spring," Harry said. "He did the unit with both of us." "You knew the Bezoar answer too." "He didn't ask me," Hermione said. "He would have if I'd been closer to the front." She paused. "He's going to be consistent about this. It's not going to be an occasional bad day." "I know," Harry said. "Does it bother you?" Harry thought about it. "A bit, not the way he wants it to." He shifted his bag to the other shoulder. "He's grieving, I think, in a very angry way." Hermione looked at him sideways. "My mum," Harry said simply. "She was his. They were friends when they were young, before everything went wrong. Sirius mentioned it once. Snape looks at me and sees her and she's dead and he can't stand it." He paused. "I'm not saying he gets to take it out on me. I'm saying I understand what it is." Hermione walked beside him for a moment in silence. "You're remarkably even-tempered about it." "I'm saving my actual feelings for something that deserves them." She nodded. "Fair." Quirrell they'd known about Sirius had been vague on the specifics but had said to watch the defense teacher carefully, which was the kind of warning that meant I know something I'm not telling you yet, and which both of them had filed under important. Professor Quirrell was nervous and twitchy and stuttered through his introductory lecture and looked at Harry once very quickly with something in his eyes that was not nervousness and was not twitchiness and was gone before it could be examined. Hermione caught it. Harry caught it. They did not look at each other in the moment, because they'd both learned from Sirius that the most important thing when you've noticed something the other person doesn't know you've noticed is to continue appearing not to have noticed. They discussed it that night in the Gryffindor common room in the low-voiced, rapid exchange way that came naturally to them after years of talking through problems at the kitchen table. "The turban," Hermione said. "The smell." "I can't place it, but it's not wrong," Harry said. "It smells wrong, like something you'd use to mask another smell, or someone." Hermione looked at him. "You think there's something under the turban?" "I think Quirrell is very frightened. I think frightened people are frightened of something specific." He stretched his legs out toward the fire. "And I think Sirius said, 'Watch the defense teacher,' in exactly the voice he uses when he thinks I'll figure it out and doesn't want to shortcut the figuring." Hermione considered. "He also said, 'Watch the third-floor corridor,' which is forbidden, which we haven't gone to yet." Harry looked at her. "I'm not suggesting we go tonight," she said. "I'm noting that the two data points, forbidden corridor, strange defense professor, are almost certainly connected. We need more information before any action makes sense." "When do we have enough information?" "We'll know," she said. "We usually know." He nodded and leaned back, and Neville Longbottom, who had arrived in their orbit on the train via Trevor the Toad, and had been adopted into their loose companionship with the comfortable, unconscious ease that lonely, kind people adopt, brought over 3 mugs of hot chocolate from the common room table and said, "You two are very serious for the end of the first week." "We're serious people," Harry said. "You were laughing about the moving staircases this morning." "We contain multitudes," Hermione said, taking the mug. Neville sat down in the remaining chair with the look of someone who is extremely pleased to have been included and is trying not to show it too obviously. He was round-faced and gentle and considerably more perceptive than people gave him credit for, which was a thing Harry had noticed in the first 3 days and which made him like Neville quite a lot. October in Hogwarts was cold and golden and full of Quidditch. Harry made the team on the second tryout in early October, which was later than Sirius had predicted, and for reasons Sirius would have found irritating. Oliver Wood had initially been reluctant purely on the basis of age, which Harry had addressed by getting on a borrowed broom during the open practice session and performing a dive that made 3 chasers stop what they were doing to watch. Wood had written down his name with the expression of a man who has just solved a problem and is simultaneously aware it's going to create new ones. He owled Sirius that evening. Sirius's reply came back before breakfast the next morning in a letter that was 3 inches long and composed entirely in capitals, and that Hermione read over Harry's shoulder at the table and annotated mentally for enthusiasm. "He woke up to write this," she said. "He probably never went to sleep," Harry said. "That tracks," Ron said, eating toast. "The troll happened on Halloween." Looking back on it, Hermione would note that the sequence of events had a logic that was almost insulting in its straightforwardness. Quirrell's panic in the Great Hall, the troll let into the dungeons, the teachers dispersing, herself in the bathroom because she'd been crying because she'd overheard something unkind from someone who hadn't understood that she wasn't being a show-off. She was just being herself. She'd cried in the bathroom and been annoyed at herself for crying, because being annoyed was more useful than being sad, and she was working through the annoyance when the troll came through the bathroom wall. She had half a second of pure, adrenaline-white fear, and then 2 things happened simultaneously. The bathroom door banged open and Harry was there, wand already drawn, and something in her chest that she'd always known was there and never directly examined pulled taut like a string being plucked, and the fear receded to something she could use rather than something using her. Harry didn't look at the troll the way people looked at something dangerous. He looked at it the way he looked at a chess problem, assessing, quick calculating distance and trajectory with the instinct of a born flyer who'd spent years learning how things moved through space. Wand, he said to Hermione. She already had it. Get high, he said. It's height-oriented. It'll track the lower target. She'd already noticed this. You're the lower target. I'm also faster. He was already moving, cutting left, drawing the troll's attention with the specific kind of movement that was neither fleeing nor attacking but something in between, the broom rider's instinct for managing a large object by getting inside its radius of effectiveness. Hermione went up a Wingardium Leviosa on the nearest stall door, which gave her a platform 2 feet above floor level, and from there the angle changed and she could see the club in the troll's hand and the arc it was going to travel, and she cast the Leviosa on the club itself, not to stop it but to redirect it, which required a precision she'd never actually tried in combat conditions, and which worked because she'd practiced it on progressively heavier objects for 3 months and knew how the spell felt at this weight. The club rose. The troll stared at it with the bewildered outrage of something that has always solved problems, with force encountering a problem force couldn't solve. Harry from the left put a trip jinx on its feet with perfect timing, which was a second-year spell he'd learned in August from one of Remus's extracurriculum texts, and when the troll fell it was away from both of them and it fell hard, and the club came down on its own head with a sound like a bell, and the bathroom was suddenly very loud with the troll's dazed groaning and then very quiet. Harry and Hermione stood in the wrecked bathroom with water on the floor and plaster dust in the air, and Ron Weasley in the doorway looking between them and the troll with his mouth slightly open. That was, Ron said, genuinely one of the most, and neither of you looks. We're fine, Harry said. He looked at Hermione. She looked back at him. She was slightly out of breath and there was plaster on her shoulder and she was holding her wand at her side with complete steadiness. The Leviosa on the club, she said. I've never tried that at that weight. It worked. It worked, she agreed. I should note that. You should note it right now while there's an unconscious troll on the floor. The conditions are unlikely to repeat. Harry opened his mouth, closed it. Fair, he said. Ron made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something slightly more emotional, and Harry looked at him and Ron straightened up and said, I should have come sooner. I knew she was in here and I came after you and I should have just... You came, Hermione said. She looked at him steadily. That's what matters. When the professors arrived, McGonagall first, with Snape and Quirrell right behind, the troll was unconscious, the 3 first-years were standing, and all 3 of their wands were out. McGonagall looked at the scene with the expression of a woman doing very rapid and extremely alarmed calculations, and then she looked at Harry and Hermione specifically, and something shifted in her assessment. She took 5 points from each of them for being out after curfew and 5 from Ron, and then gave 10 back to each for exceptional presence of mind, and the arithmetic left Harry and Hermione up 5 points apiece. Snape looked at the troll and then at the 2 first-years and then at the troll again with an expression that gave nothing away except, very briefly, something that might have been reluctant calculation. Quirrell looked at the far wall and didn't look at Harry at all. McGonagall kept Harry and Hermione back as the others went. She looked at them. They looked at her. She was a tall, precise, formidably intelligent woman who had been teaching for 40 years and had sorted and taught and assessed thousands of students, and she was looking at these 2 the way she occasionally looked at a problem in Transfiguration that was more interesting than she'd initially expected. Who taught you the trip jinx, Mr. Potter? She said. It's not on the first-year curriculum. Remus Lupin, Harry said. And the Leviosa at that application of force, Miss Granger, the theory behind redirecting moving objects rather than lifting them is 3rd-year standard. I read ahead, Hermione said. McGonagall looked at them for another moment. Then she said, the 2 of you in my experience are most likely to get into trouble when operating together. I say this not as criticism but as observed fact. She paused. You handled that well. It was not a warm statement. It was a precise statement from a precise woman, and it landed exactly as intended. Thank you, Professor, Hermione said. They went back to the common room where Ron told Fred and George what had happened in real time, and the twins listened with increasing delight and gave Harry a running commentary on previous troll-related incidents in Hogwarts history that was entirely unhelpful and completely appreciated. November came in cold and brought with it the first Quidditch match. Harry flew the way he always flew, like it was the most natural thing in his body, like gravity was a suggestion rather than a law, and caught the snitch in 8 minutes in a dive that left the Slytherin seeker still looking up while Harry was already descending, the gold glinting in his closed fist. The Gryffindor stand made noise that could probably be heard from Hogsmeade. Hermione had watched from the stands next to Ron and Neville with her scarf held against her face in the cold, and she had been for those 8 minutes not analytical at all. December brought Christmas, and Christmas brought Grimmauld Place, and Grimmauld Place brought the smell of Sirius's cooking, which had improved significantly over 7 years but still retained a quality of hopefulness over precision, and Remus's books spread across the sitting room table and the fire and the biscuits. Harry and Hermione sat at the kitchen table on the 2nd evening back and told Sirius and Remus everything in the systematic way they developed for debrief, taking turns filling in each other's gaps, Sirius listened, Remus listened, neither of them interrupted. When they finished, Sirius said, "Quirrell." "Yes," Harry said. "How sure are you?" "Sure enough." Sirius looked at Remus. Remus looked at Sirius. The same 2-second wordless conversation they'd been having for 7 years. "What's behind the third-floor corridor?" Remus said. "We don't know yet," Hermione said. "We've identified it as connected but haven't had enough time to." "Dumbledore's protecting something," Sirius said flatly. "He does this. He hides things in plain sight because he trusts the curiosity of clever students to solve the thing he set up before anyone from outside can reach it." His voice was careful and not happy. "I'd put good odds it's connected to Voldemort's current state. Whatever's left of him." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "And Quirrell is the access point," Hermione said. "Yes, then the year will end in the corridor," Harry said. It wasn't dramatic the way he said it, just logical. "Whatever's there, Quirrell wants it, and at some point the wanting will win over the hiding." "You're not going near that corridor," Sirius said. Harry looked at him with polite, absolute patience. Sirius held the look for a moment and then ran a hand through his hair. "Going to go near that corridor, aren't you?" "Only if it becomes necessary," Hermione said. "Hermione, I said if." Sirius looked at Remus again with the expression this time of a man who has raised 2 very intelligent people and is experiencing the specific consequence of having done it well. "Conditions," Remus said. "Tell us what you find as you find it. No action without discussion first unless you're in immediate danger, in which case you use your own judgment, which I trust." He looked at both of them. "And write to us more." "You said that last term," Hermione said. "I meant it last term too," she nodded. Then without preamble she leaned across and hugged him, quick and firm, and pulled back immediately with the brisk unself-consciousness of someone who is demonstrating affection rather than performing it. Remus looked at the table for a second, then he looked up and said, "More tea?" "Yes, please," Harry said. The corridor came in June. It came the way inevitable things come, not suddenly, but with a gathering momentum that had been building since September. It came because Quirrell's wanting finally won over the hiding, because the protection's on the stone and they'd worked out what it was by April, following the thread from the newspaper story Hermione had clipped in August, were being systematically bypassed, because someone had to go, and because Harry had stopped asking should we somewhere around May and started asking when. They went at night, all 3 of them, because Ron Weasley had proven himself in a bathroom in October, and neither Harry nor Hermione was the kind of person who left people who'd earned trust out of the conversation. They got through the protections in sequence: Fluffy, the Devil's Snare, the Winged Keys, the chessboard, the troll, the logic puzzle. The chessboard was Ron's. He saw the solution in 4 moves and played it with the steady hands of someone who has always known this is what chess is actually for. And when the White Queen struck his piece down and he toppled sideways, Harry caught him before he hit the stone floor, and Hermione was already kneeling next to him, checking his pulse, steady and sure, and Ron opened his eyes and said, "Go, it's fine, go." The logic puzzle was Hermione's in 30 seconds. She looked at it, walked the bottles, said there, and picked it up and handed it to Harry. Harry looked at her. They were standing at the door that led forward, and the warmth of the torches was behind them, and ahead was something neither of them had fully seen yet. "Together," she said. "Obviously," he said. The final chamber was small and stone and held a mirror and a man, and the man was Quirrell, and the thing behind Quirrell's eyes was something older and colder than Quirrell himself, wearing him like a costume. It looked at Harry with the red hunger of something that had been waiting. "Harry Potter," Voldemort said through Quirrell's mouth. At last. Harry looked at what remained of Voldemort. He didn't feel the thing he'd been afraid he might feel, the childhood night terror, the weight of being the boy. He felt something simpler and cleaner. He felt the thing Sirius had spent years building in him, the absolute certainty of who he was and who was standing beside him and what that meant. "You look awful," Harry said, "for someone who people were so frightened of." Quirrell's hands twitched, the voice from behind his eyes sharpened. "You have your mother's rudeness and her unfortunate tendency to die for pointless causes." Hermione moved before Harry even registered she was going to. Not toward Quirrell, around him, to the mirror, because she'd understood the mirror's function 2 chambers ago when she'd connected Dumbledore's logic to the original Flamel story, and her understanding of it was precise. She didn't look into it to see herself using it. She looked into it thinking only about getting the stone away from the person who wanted it, and she felt something cold and round fall into her pocket, and she kept walking, putting herself on the other side of the mirror from Quirrell. Quirrell spun toward her. Harry was already between them, and the hand he put out caught Quirrell's arm with the full force of his grip, and Quirrell screamed. The burning started. Harry felt it in his palms, the same protective magic that had saved him the first time, Lily's love made into something physical and permanent, and it tore through whatever Quirrell was and what was inside him with an efficiency that had nothing to do with violence and everything to do with what it was. Harry held on because the people behind him were counting on the next 5 seconds, and he held on until Quirrell went limp, and the shadow tore itself free, formless, howling, and Harry felt it pass through him, and it was terrible and also over very quickly. The chamber was quiet. Harry and Hermione stood in it with the unconscious Quirrell at their feet and the mirror behind them and the stone in Hermione's pocket. "That worked," Harry said, slightly out of breath. "The mirror's function was always about desire," Hermione said. Her voice was steady, which he suspected was costing her something. If you only want it to keep it safe, you see yourself with it. If you want to use it, Hermione. What? Later, he looked at her. She was pale under the torchlight, and there was a tension across her jaw that was the specific kind that meant she was holding everything together with precision and would debrief it fully at some other time. Are you all right? She looked at him, something in her face shifted, the precision stayed but the held-together quality softened, just slightly the way it did when it was him asking rather than a situation demanding. I will be, she said. When we're out, he nodded. He offered his hand to help her over Quirrell, which she didn't need but took anyway, and they went back through the chambers to where Ron was waiting and out and up. Dumbledore found them before they'd made it back to the hospital wing. He appeared in the corridor with the particular air of a man who had been elsewhere on purpose and returned when the purpose was served, and he looked at Harry and Hermione with the assessment of someone recalculating something large. The stone, he said. Hermione put it in his hand without ceremony. Dumbledore looked at it, then at her, then at Harry. I see, he said quietly, and there was in his voice the tone of a man who had expected cleverness and received something beyond cleverness and was genuinely, uncomplicatedly surprised. The corridor was compromised, Harry said. We thought you should know. I did know, Dumbledore said. I was not, I confess, expecting you to have resolved the matter so efficiently. He paused. You will both receive considerable points for Gryffindor. You will also receive a letter from me over the summer that I hope you will read carefully. Harry and Hermione looked at each other. The stone should be destroyed, Hermione said to Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked at her. I have been in conversation with Nicholas Flamel. He and his wife have had long and fruitful lives. He agrees. She nodded. It was the answer she'd expected, and the fact that Dumbledore gave it cleanly and without deflection told her something about him that she logged alongside everything else. Mr. Weasley, Dumbledore said, looking down the corridor to where Ron was still slightly unsteady on his feet. 10 points to Gryffindor for the finest chess I've seen played in 40 years. Ron straightened immediately. Harry put a hand on his shoulder. They went to the hospital wing, and Madame Pomfrey clucked over all three of them, and by the time Sirius arrived through the flue at 11 at night with a face that had been doing several things simultaneously since Harry's owl at 9, the worst of it was over and Harry was sitting up in a hospital bed eating the last of Madame Pomfrey's biscuit supply. Sirius sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at Harry's hands, which were healed but still faintly pink. The touch, he said. Yeah, Harry said. Sirius exhaled. Your mum, he said, still looking out for you. Yeah, Harry said again more quietly. Sirius looked at Hermione in the next bed, who was sitting up with a book she'd asked for from the hospital wing shelf and was reading with the particular focused serenity of someone who has had a very large day and is now processing it in the way that works best for her. He looked at her and thought about Emma Granger, who'd been a careful woman and who'd put Remus's name on a form and who couldn't have imagined what that one act would lead to. You did good, Sirius said to both of them. Hermione looked up from her book. We did what was necessary, she said. That's what doing good usually is, Sirius said. She considered this for a moment, then nodded and went back to her book. Sirius looked at Harry, who was watching Hermione with the expression he sometimes had that was layered in a way that would have been interesting to look at in another few years and was, right now, simply warm and certain and entirely itself. Harry caught Sirius watching and didn't look away. We are fine, he said. I know, Sirius said. That's not actually what I'm looking at. Harry looked at the blanket. Something in his face shifted, a brief private recalibration, and then he looked up again. I know, Harry said. Just making sure you do, Sirius said. Outside the hospital wing, June rain ran down the stone walls of Hogwarts and the castle settled into the quiet of an evening after a large thing. And inside, first year ended the way first year had begun, with two people who knew where they needed to be, and who were without question exactly there. Chapter 4, The Chamber Knows Their Names. The summer after first year had the quality of something earned. Not earned in the dramatic sense, no ceremony, no particular acknowledgement, but in the quieter sense of two people who had done something difficult and come home to find that home was exactly where they'd left it, and that this was itself a kind of reward. Grimmauld Place in July was warm in the way London gets warm in summer, which is not the warm of open countryside but the warm of sunlight on old stone and the smell of the city coming through open windows. Remus had taken the back garden in hand, and it was unrecognizable from the overgrown square of black family neglect it had been the previous autumn. There were tomatoes. Sirius had opinions about the tomatoes, primarily that they were taking up space that could be used for a better broom repair area, and Remus had opinions about Sirius's opinions, primarily that he was welcome to the part of the garden currently covered in shadow. Harry and Hermione spent most of July outdoors. They'd come back from Hogwarts with the particular restlessness of people who had learned a lot and now needed space to let it settle, and Remus, who understood this instinctively, gave them the freedom to settle it in their own way, which turned out to be a combination of reading, Quidditch practice in a park 2 streets over with a disillusionment charm on the broom, and long, sprawling conversations that went from history to magic theory to Quidditch statistics to things neither of them had said aloud before, because there'd been less space for the particular kind of private honesty that outdoor summer afternoons made possible. It was in one of these conversations, lying on the dry grass in the garden with a book each that neither of them was currently reading, that Hermione said, Do you think about your parents much? Harry looked at the sky. All the time, he said. In a background way, not sad exactly, more like I'm always aware of the shape of where they should be. Yes, Hermione said, that's exactly right. A pause. I dream about my mother sometimes. I don't actually remember her, but in the dreams she's very clear. Brown eyes, she smelled like something clean. Another pause. I've decided not to find it sad, it's just information about who she was. Harry turned his head to look at her. She was looking at the sky too, her profile clean and still in the afternoon light. Does that work? He said, deciding not to find it sad. Mostly. She glanced at him. Does anything work for you? Having Sirius, Harry said immediately. And Remus, and you. He said the last part without particular emphasis, the way you say true things that don't require decoration. Hermione was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know, in a tone that meant she understood exactly what he meant and was acknowledging all of it. The letter from Dumbledore arrived in the second week of August. It was long, 2 feet, dense and careful, and it covered in Dumbledore's characteristically layered way the subject of what Harry and Hermione were to the wizarding world, what Harry specifically represented as a symbol, and the question of the prophecy. He did not reproduce the prophecy in full. He said only that there was one and that it concerned Harry and that when the time was right he would share it directly. Sirius read the letter 3 times, then passed it to Remus, then sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and said nothing for 4 minutes, which was a record. Remus read it once, set it down, looked at the 2 children across the table. He's telling you there's a prophecy, he said to Harry. He's not telling you what it says. I know, Harry said. How do you feel about that? Harry thought about it. Curious, he said. Not scared. I figure he'll tell me when he thinks it's the right time and I'll figure out for myself whether he was right about the timing. Sirius looked at him over his coffee. That's remarkably measured of you. I've had a good example, Harry said, and looked at Sirius with the directness that was one of his most consistent qualities, and Sirius picked up his coffee and looked at the ceiling. Hermione had not said anything yet. She was reading the letter herself the 3rd time with the specific focus she brought to primary sources. She set it down and looked at her own hands for a moment. He's also telling us, she said, indirectly that our involvement last June was expected, not managed. He's careful to say he didn't engineer it, but expected. Yes, Remus said, he's tracking what we can do. She wasn't alarmed, she was precise. He's been tracking it since the night we were brought here. That's not a problem necessarily, but it's something to be aware of. Always be aware of who's watching and why, Sirius said. It was one of the Marauder maxims, said frequently enough over the years that it had the quality of a reflex. Hermione nodded. Exactly. 2nd year began on the 1st of September with the particular quality of returning somewhere you've already established yourself. The castle felt differently, familiar in its bones, the staircases known, the shortcuts memorized, the rhythms of it already in the body. Ron met them on the platform and immediately launched into a detailed account of what the twins had done to Percy's prefect badge over the summer, which was funny enough that Hermione laughed with the full-body unself-consciousness she reserved for things that genuinely caught her off guard. The first thing wrong was the car. Harry and Ron had not made the train a collapsed barrier, a malfunction that felt too specific to be accidental, and by the time the enchanted Ford Anglia arrived over the Whomping Willow, Hermione had already been in the castle for 5 hours and had spent 2 of them with a low-level, persistent awareness at the back of her mind that was new and not entirely comfortable. She knew Harry was fine. She'd known from the moment his absence registered on the train with the clean certainty of a compass that still knows north even when north isn't in the room. But knowing was different from having him where she could see him, and the discomfort of the difference was information she filed under the bond, noted, "We'll think about this properly later." When he walked into the Gryffindor common room at 11:30 with Ron and a face full of tree scratches and bark dust, she looked at him once, the full once, top to bottom checking, and then said the barrier was deliberate. Harry dropped into the nearest chair. I know, someone didn't want you on that train. I know, we need to know who. I know, he looked at her. All right if I eat first, I had an argument with a tree. She brought him food from the kitchens, which she'd worked out how to access in October of 1st year and had been using as needed ever since, and they sat in the common room long after everyone else had gone to bed and worked through what they knew, which wasn't much but was the right shape of not much. It had direction, it had a logic, and the logic pointed at something deliberate rather than accidental. The voice in the walls started in November. Harry heard it first. Walking down a corridor between charms and lunch, he stopped so suddenly that Ron walked into his back and Hermione had taken 3 more steps before she realized he'd gone still. She turned. He was standing with his head slightly tilted and his expression the way it got when he was listening to something nobody else could hear, not confused but intensely focused. Harry, she said. There's a voice, he said. She looked at the wall. In the wall. Moving. It's moving through it. Like something in the pipes. He paused. It's speaking. I can't. He stopped, turned to look at her. Can you hear it? She listened. She had excellent hearing and she employed it fully. She heard nothing except the castle's standard background of distant footsteps and someone's cat somewhere being dramatic. No, she said. It's gone now anyway. He looked at the wall for a moment longer, then at her. I heard words. I couldn't make them out properly, but I heard words. Ron said something living in the walls that speaks is very bad, Hermione said, or very unusual, possibly both. She started walking again, faster now. I need the library. You always need the library, Ron said. Usually I'm right too, she said. She was right too. It took 3 days of cross-referencing historical magical incidents at Hogwarts with known magical creatures and the specific quality of what Harry described, moving through stone, speaking predatory before she arrived at Basilisk, which she sat with for a full 60 seconds because the implications were significant, and then she wrote it down in her notebook and closed it and went to find Harry. She told him in the corridor outside the library. Not in the library because Ron was in there and this needed Harry first alone before the wider conversation. He listened. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he said, "That's a snake. A magical snake of lethal size and capability. Yes, I can speak parcel tongue." I know. She'd known since second year started. Sirius had mentioned it over the summer in a context she'd filed carefully. The night Voldemort had tried to kill Harry, something of Voldemort's abilities had transferred through the failed curse. Parcel tongue was one of them, which means you might be able to hear it because it's speaking. He looked at her with the sharp clarity that happened when pieces connected in his head. I'm hearing it speak. Yes, which means it's actually been close to me. Yes, which means the heir of Slytherin, whoever they are, has been. He stopped. The muscles in his jaw tightened in a way that Hermione recognized. Not anger exactly, the precursor to anger, the thing that happens when you fully understand that something has been threatening the people around you without your knowledge. We don't know who the heir is yet, she said. We need to find out before we can do anything about the snake. How do we find out? Polyjuice potion, she said immediately. Slytherin's common room, we need someone inside who's talking. Harry looked at her. That's a 6-month brewing process for a plan that involves impersonating Slytherin students. Yes, Remus is going to have feelings about this. Remus is going to have many feelings about this, she agreed. And most of them will be because it's technically illegal and potentially dangerous, and some of them will also be because it's clever, and those two sets of feelings will conflict in ways that will make him very Remus about the whole situation. Harry almost smiled. When do we start? I started 2 days ago, she said. When I first found the Basilisk reference, I wanted to confirm the identification before bringing you the full plan. He looked at her. You've been working on this for 2 days without telling me. I was gathering data. Hermione, I was going to tell you as soon as I was confident in the identification, which you are now, which I am now. He held the look for a moment longer, and it was the kind of look that had weight behind it, not frustration, not exactly, but the particular kind of almost frustration that comes from being someone who needs to be in things together and occasionally has to wait for the other person's process to complete. She understood it because she felt the equivalent occasionally in the other direction, the moments when Harry moved faster than information and she had to keep up or accept being left behind, which she refused to do. Together, she said. From here, together, he agreed. Ron, when they told him, said Polyjuice potion with the expression of someone who'd heard both words separately but found them alarming in combination, and then said, right, what do we need? The brewing went in Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, which was private and damp and smelled like old pipes, and which Hermione used with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who'd identified the resource and was not going to let its emotional atmosphere interfere with its utility. She ran the brewing with the care of someone whose respect for potions was not performed. She genuinely found the chemistry of it beautiful, the way each ingredient interacted with precision, the way timing mattered down to the second. The attacks continued through October and November, Mrs. Norris first, and then Colin Creevey, which hit Harry harder than he showed because Colin was 11 and had a camera and a boundless, guileless admiration that had nothing calculating in it. Justin Finch-Fletchley and nearly headless Nick, which was deeply strange and required Hermione to revisit her basilisk research to account for an indirect reflection rendering someone petrified rather than dead. The chamber message went up in late November, red paint over stone. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the heir beware. Harry and Hermione stood in the corridor in front of it. They'd been the first to arrive at the scene by chance of route and looked at it, and the thing that passed between them in that moment was not fear. It was the recognition that this was now operating at a scale that changed the parameters. Someone opened it, Hermione said, which means it was opened before. 50 years ago, Harry said, I found a reference in an old library record while you were in the restricted section last week. A Muggle-born girl died. The heir was accused, but it was covered up. She looked at him. You've been doing research. I've been doing research, he confirmed. I wasn't going to tell you until I had something concrete. A pause. Then she said fair, which was the exact word he'd used in the bathroom the year before, and the symmetry of it was deliberate, and he registered it. Tom Riddle, he said, the boy who was blamed 50 years ago. The chamber was supposedly sealed after his accusation. And now it's open again, Hermione said, which means either someone found a new way in or the sealing was never complete. She looked at the message. And the heir is very confident about being the heir. This is a declaration, not a warning, which means they're not hiding, or they think they are but they're wrong, she said. People who leave declarations usually want to be identified at some level. Draco Malfoy was the obvious suspect and they both knew it, and spent several weeks pursuing the obvious before Hermione's evidence pulled them in a different direction. It was a diary, not a student, a diary found in Myrtle's bathroom with the name T.M. Riddle on it, which Ginny Weasley had been carrying, and which Harry had picked up and which had talked back to him in the curling, persuasive script of something that wanted to be trusted. Harry had brought it to Hermione immediately. She'd looked at it for 30 seconds and said, "Don't write in it again," with an authority that came from having identified the enchantment in the time it took most people to read the cover, and Harry had already not been going to because the diary felt the way Quirrell had felt, like something that wanted to get inside you by being helpful. "It's a piece of him," Harry said. "Yes," she said. "I think so. A memory, maybe, something preserved and set loose. How do we destroy it?" She thought about it. Something that destroys magical objects completely. Basilisk venom would do it. We don't currently have easy access to basilisk venom. No, she agreed. So first we find out who has the diary now and we take it back and then we work out the venom question. The diary went missing before they could trace it, and then in February Hermione was petrified. She didn't see it coming. In retrospect, she would identify the precise error. She'd been moving through the library alone, which she'd done safely for 6 months, and the logical failure was not the motion but the overconfidence, the place where her understanding of the threat had become too abstract and she'd stopped treating the castle as actively dangerous. The basilisk had been reflected in a mirror she was carrying. She'd been carrying it for exactly this contingency and had been holding it slightly wrong, the angle slightly off, the reflection catching her eye at the edge of her peripheral vision. She had half a second of awareness. She used it to write on the piece of parchment already in her hand 2 words, pipes, roosters, and then the grey pulled in and everything was still. She was aware of being aware. Not of the world, exactly. The basilisk's venom working on her nervous system created a suspended state that wasn't sleep and wasn't death. A frustrating and very cold clarity in which she could think but couldn't act, couldn't speak, couldn't read. She had only what was already in her head. She spent it usefully. She went through everything she knew about the chamber, about Salazar Slytherin, about plumbing structures in medieval Scottish castles, about the diary and Tom Riddle and what a piece of a person preserved in an object would want, because things that want always want something specific and the specificity was the weakness, and about Harry, who she knew with the deep bone certainty of the bond was going to come for her, because that was simply who Harry was. She was not afraid for herself. She was, with a precision she found clarifying, afraid for him. Harry's reaction to Hermione being petrified was quiet. That was the thing about it that Ron and Neville and even McGonagall registered as unusual. He went to the hospital wing, he stood next to her bed, he looked at her face, which was still and marble pale and held, even petrified, the expression of someone in the middle of a thought, and he was very quiet. He picked up the parchment from her stiff fingers carefully. "Read the 2 words, read them again." "Pipes," he said to Ron, who was standing behind him. "She worked it out," Ron said softly. "She worked it out before it got her," Harry said. "She wrote it down because she knew she needed to tell me." He folded the parchment and put it in his pocket. Then he looked at Hermione for a moment longer and the quiet resolved itself into something very specific and very cold. "Right," he said. "We need to find the entrance to the chamber. Harry, we need the heir of Slytherin, we need the diary, and we need Parseltongue." He looked at Ron. "The pipes run from the girl's bathroom in Moaning Myrtles. That's where she's been all year. That's where the entrance is." "How do you know?" "Because the pipes lead somewhere and the entrance needs Parseltongue to open, and Myrtle's been in that bathroom since the 1940s, since..." He stopped, looked at the parchment again. "Since she died, the basilisk went through those pipes. It killed her, that's the access point." Ron looked at him. "We should get a teacher." "No, not aggressively, just simply. The heir is already inside the chamber. Someone has already gone in. If we wait for the teachers, the person inside dies." He looked at Ron steadily. "I need you with me or I need you to stay here and watch Hermione. Both are valid choices and I mean that." Ron was quiet for a second, then, "I'm with you," he said. "Obviously." "Thank you," Harry said. They found Lockhart trying to leave the castle. This was the thing that resolved the last missing piece. Lockhart, cornered in his office, stuffing his bags with the frantic energy of a man whose performance had finally met a situation that required the real thing, and confessing in 6 panicked sentences that he'd never done any of it. None of the books, none of the stories, memory charms on the actual wizards who'd done it, names taken, credit assumed. Harry looked at him with the flat assessment of someone who'd always had questions about Lockhart and was now receiving confirmation. "You're coming with us," he said. "I really rather don't think. We need someone to explain to the teachers what happened. If we don't come back, you're the last person who saw us go in." Harry picked up Lockhart's wand from the desk, looked at it, handed it back. "You're coming with us." Lockhart came with them. This was, in the event, unfortunate in the specific way that incompetent people in high-stakes situations are unfortunate, not malicious, just catastrophically unreliable. He tried to memory charm both of them in the chamber tunnel. Ron disarmed him with Expelliarmus that he'd been practicing since October, and that hit Lockhart squarely in the chest, and the memory charm went wild and brought the tunnel ceiling down with a concussive explosion that left Ron and Lockhart on one side of a wall of rock and Harry on the other. Harry stood in the dark of the lower passage with rubble at his back and the chamber ahead, and Ron's muffled voice filtering through the rockfall assuring him he was fine. just temporarily geographically separated. Go on, he'd deal with Lockhart, who was sitting in the rubble looking pleasantly confused. Harry lit his wand and went forward. The chamber was extraordinary, and he allowed himself one breath of acknowledgement before he focused. Long stone serpent-carved columns rising to a ceiling lost in darkness, water on the floor, the smell of wet stone and something else, something ancient. At the far end, slumped against Slytherin's statue, was Ginny Weasley, and crouching over her was a boy. 16 years old, dark-haired, handsome in the specific way of people who know they're handsome and have organized their sense of self around it. The diary was on the ground beside him, gleaming, almost solid with the life it had been drawing out of Ginny across half a year. He looked at Harry with the red intelligence of something that had been waiting a very long time. Tom Riddle, Harry said. Harry Potter. Riddle stood. He was already half substantial, more present in the chamber than he'd been in any vision or any memory, drawing Ginny's life force into himself and building something. I've been wanting to meet you properly. The last time was, well, you were barely conscious for most of it. You need to stop what you're doing to Ginny Weasley, Harry said. I need the diary destroyed, Riddle said. That's the only thing that will sever the connection at this point. The question is whether you have anything that could. I have the basilisk, Harry said, which you control, which you're about to direct at me, which I need to not look at while also keeping track of where it is in a chamber the size of this one. He looked at Riddle steadily. So we can save some time by just skipping to that part. Riddle tilted his head. You're not afraid of me. You're 16 and you're made of stolen life force and ink, no offense. Something moved in Riddle's face, not quite anger, more the specific irritation of a person who's prepared an entrance and been denied the audience reaction they'd planned for. You're a great deal more like me than you know, he said. So people keep saying, Harry said. It hasn't been accurate yet. He looked at the diary on the floor. He looked at Ginny. He looked at where the great carved serpent's mouth gaped at the far end of the chamber, the darkness behind it moving, the basilisk somewhere in that dark, waiting for a direction. He had exactly one advantage, and it was specific. He'd spoken Parseltongue since he was 9. He'd practiced it not often, but Remus had insisted on understanding every aspect of what the Night of the Failed Curse had transferred, and Parseltongue was one of those aspects, and they'd spent 3 careful afternoons testing its limits. He knew how to speak it with intent. He knew how to direct with it rather than simply translate. He opened his mouth and spoke to the darkness, not to come, to wait. In Parseltongue, the distinction between commands was a matter of intonation more than vocabulary, and the intonation of wait was something close to a question rather than an order, and the basilisk, responding to a speaker who sounded like its master but wasn't quite, hesitated. Riddle's expression changed. Fawkes arrived at exactly that moment, which Harry registered with profound gratitude and zero surprise. Because Dumbledore's familiar was, he decided in first year, a creature operating on a level of awareness that made coincidence the wrong word for anything it did. The phoenix landed on Harry's shoulder with a weight that was heavier than a bird its size should be and immediately resolved one of Harry's most pressing problems by producing the sorting hat, which dropped something long and cold and gleaming into Harry's hand. A sword, rubies in the hilt, Gryffindor's sword with the specific weight and balance of something real. Riddle's face went through several things very fast. You really are remarkable, he said, and there was something that was almost genuine admiration in it, which was the most unsettling thing he'd said so far because it was the first thing that sounded true. You can tell me what Horcruxes are later, Harry said, which made Riddle go completely still in the way of someone hearing a word they didn't expect, but right now I'm going to deal with your snake. Riddle directed the basilisk, of course he did. It came through the mouth of the statue with the devastating speed of something 60 feet long that has been waiting in stone corridors for decades, and it came with its eyes open. And Harry had his own eyes shut before it emerged because he'd been counting the seconds from when he'd heard the first movement. He fought it blind. Not entirely blind, Fawkes was above him, providing the directional information of a creature whose spatial awareness was not vision-dependent, and Harry moved on sound and instinct and the training Sirius had given him, which was not conventional dueling training but the specific, unconventional, marauder-inflected understanding of how to fight something bigger and faster than you by never being where it expected you to be. The basilisk struck twice and missed twice, and on the third strike Harry was already at the statue's base and going up it with the sword in both hands, the climb not graceful but fast, and he drove the sword into the roof of the basilisk's open mouth from below, and the blade went in clean and deep, and the great creature fell with a sound like a building coming down. The fang caught him in the arm on the way down. He felt it sharp and cold and immediately wrong, the venom working like ice spreading from the puncture, and he landed in the water and sat there for a moment holding his arm and looking at the ceiling of the chamber which was obscured in darkness, and listening to the dying sounds of the oldest living thing he'd ever killed, and he felt not triumph, something more complicated. Fawkes landed next to him and cried on the wound, and the ice stopped spreading, and Harry picked himself up. Riddle was fading, not gone, the diary was still intact, but the loss of the basilisk had severed something. The life force Ginny had been feeding him interrupted by the snake's death, and he was looking at Harry with an expression that was now stripped of its performance and was simply itself, a boy who had never understood anything except wanting and taking and being clever about both, watching someone operate from a completely different set of values and unable to fully account for it. How? Riddle said, "You don't even hate me." "No," Harry said. He picked up the basilisk fang from the chamber floor. "I don't." He drove it through the diary. The scream that came out of it was something he felt in the bones of his hands, and the ink bled out black and then darker than black, and Riddle came apart the way shadows come apart when you turn on a light, quickly, without ceremony, and then entirely gone. Ginny's eyes opened. She looked at the ceiling of the chamber, then at Harry, then at the basilisk, then at Harry again. "Am I?" she started. "You're fine," Harry said. "Can you walk?" She could walk. They walked out through the long chamber and back through the passages, and Harry talked to the pipes in Parseltongue to redirect the water flow, and to the stone to tell him where the falls were, and Ginny held onto his non-injured arm with both hands and didn't ask him how he knew how to do any of this, because she was 12 and she'd just been possessed by Voldemort for 6 months, and she was using all available processing capacity on putting one foot in front of the other. They found Ron and Lockhart contented with his confusion, Ron with a face full of rockfall dust and an expression of enormous relief, and made it back to the surface in time to run into Dumbledore and Arthur Weasley coming through the bathroom door with the simultaneous urgency of 2 people who'd arrived too late. Arthur grabbed Ginny with the desperate relief of a parent, and Dumbledore looked at Harry at the torn sleeve, the healed fang mark, the dirt and chamber water, the sword, and said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then, "The diary, destroyed," Harry said. He thought about the word Riddle had frozen at. "We need to talk about Horcruxes." Dumbledore went very still. "Where did you hear that word?" "Riddle knew I knew it," Harry said. "The way you know when someone has named the thing you thought was secret. I didn't know what it meant before today, I do now." He looked at Dumbledore with the steadiness he'd inherited from Sirius and the precision he'd built alongside Hermione. He made more than one. The silence that followed was not comfortable. Dumbledore looked at Harry with an expression that was doing several things at once: calculation, genuine shock, something that looked uncomfortably like guilt, and then he said, "I see," in the tone he'd used in June of last year, the tone of a man recalculating something large. "How many?" Harry said. "I'm not certain," Dumbledore said. "I have suspicions. I have been gathering evidence." He paused. "This conversation should happen in my office, with Sirius present, I believe." "Yes," Harry said. "And Remus?" Dumbledore looked at him. "Yes," he agreed. "And Remus?" The hospital wing held Harry for 2 days. Madame Pomfrey had opinions about basilisk fang wounds that she expressed at length, and Harry bore with patience. Sirius arrived via emergency, flew in under an hour, took one look at Harry's arm, took one look at Harry's face, and sat down on the edge of the bed and said, "Start from the beginning." Harry started from the beginning. The whole account, structured and clear, the way he'd learned to give accounts, chronological, detail significant over detail comprehensive, conclusions held until the relevant evidence had been presented. Sirius listened without interrupting. Remus, who arrived 40 minutes later, listened to the second half in the same way. When Harry finished, Remus said to the room generally, but looking at the floor, "A basilisk." "Yes, you fought a 60-foot basilisk blind with a sword." "Fawkes was navigating." Remus looked up. "Fawkes, Dumbledore's phoenix." Remus looked at Sirius. Sirius was looking at the ceiling with an expression that was managing something quite large. "The fang," Sirius said. "Fawkes healed it in time." "Yes, you're certain." "Madame Pomfrey is very certain," Harry said. "She said so several times." Sirius looked at him. Then he put his hand on Harry's head briefly, the way he sometimes did when they were both standing at the edge of something large and needed to confirm the other person was real. Harry leaned into it slightly. "The Horcruxes," Harry said, "when Dumbledore tells us what he knows." "We'll deal with it," Sirius said. "Together," Harry said. "Together," Sirius said with the simplicity of an absolute truth. Hermione was cured 3 days later with a patience that Madame Pomfrey's mandrake restorative draught finally resolved, and Harry was there when she woke up, sitting in the chair next to her bed with a book he wasn't reading, in the way he'd been sitting there every visiting hour for 3 days, and when she opened her eyes and found him there, her first expression was not surprise. It was relief. Clean and complete, the relief of someone who has been where movement isn't possible and is now finally back. "The chamber," she said immediately. "Dealt with," Harry said. "Ginny Weasley, fine. The diary, destroyed. The basilisk, also destroyed. Fawkes helped." He held up his arm where the healed wound had left a faint mark. "Fang healed. Don't make a face." She made a face. "I said don't. I'm not making a face. I'm processing information through facial expression." She pushed herself up in the bed, looked at him fully, and did the same check he'd done when he'd come back from the chamber the previous night, the full once-over top to bottom. "You're all right. I'm all right. You went into the chamber alone. Ron was there until the rockfall. You went into the chamber effectively alone." Harry looked at her. "You couldn't come," he said simply. "You'd already come. You left me the note. You told me what I needed to know." "You were with me the whole time, Hermione." He said the last part without particular emphasis, the way he said true things. "You know you were." She was quiet for a moment. Something in her face moved through several things very quickly, the way it did when she was feeling something specific and was deciding how precisely to name it. "I know," she said finally. She looked at their hands, which were side by side on the white hospital blanket, not quite touching. She turned her hand over and he put his in it, and they sat in the quiet of the hospital wing in the warm June afternoon, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there was nothing else to say. Ron appeared in the doorway with 3 plates of food from the kitchens and stopped when he saw the two of them, and had the quick, accurate 12-year-old perception to withdraw quietly and give it another 10 minutes. When he came back, Harry and Hermione were sitting normally, Hermione asking about what she'd missed in Charms, Harry eating, the ordinary texture of their companionship restored, and Ron sat down and distributed food and said, "Right, so first things first, did I tell you what Fred said to Percy about the rockfall?" "No," Harry said. "You're going to love this," Ron said. And the afternoon resolved itself into laughter and food, and the warm relief of having come through something, and outside the windows of the hospital wing, Hogwarts in summer hummed with its deep stone patience, and the pipes ran quiet now through walls that had learned 2 names, and the chamber was sealed and the diary was ash, and there was still more to come, so much more, but right now there was just this. 3 friends, one healed, one healing, one who would have walked through worse for either of them, and a castle that was, in every way that mattered, home. Chapter 5. The wolf, the map, and the man on the platform. The summer after second year was different. Not bad. The 4 of them were still at Grimmauld Place, still at the kitchen table in the mornings, still arguing about the garden and the library and who had borrowed whose annotated copy of Hogwarts, a history but different in a way that was hard to name except by noticing where it showed up. Sirius woke early more than he used to. Remus read the same page of his book more than once, sometimes without realizing. Harry found himself standing in the kitchen doorway some mornings watching both of them and understanding, with the accumulated intelligence of 12 years of paying attention, that the adults in his life were afraid of something they hadn't told him yet. He let it sit. He was a Marauder-raised child, which meant he understood the difference between information being withheld because it was being protected and information being withheld because someone was still working out how to carry it. He waited. Hermione, who also noticed, spent the summer reading everything she could find about Horcruxes, which was almost nothing, because the topic was restricted to the point of near erasure from the accessible literature, and about Voldemort's history before the name in the years when he was Tom Riddle and had not yet committed to the mythology of himself. She filled a notebook, then another. When August came, she had 2 complete notebooks and 4 partial ones, and a theory about the number 7 that she hadn't fully tested but which had the structural symmetry of a correct answer. She told Harry on the last Wednesday of August, sitting in the garden with the tomatoes Sirius still re-scented and the low evening light making everything gold. He listened to the whole thing. He didn't interrupt. Learned that her theories had internal architecture that needed to be walked through in order, that cutting in before she reached the conclusion was like entering a building through a window possible but missing the point of the door. When she finished, he said, 7, almost certainly. We found one, the diary. Yes, and Dumbledore has suspicions about others. Yes, he told you that in June. He's going to want to involve us eventually. She looked at him. He's already involving you. He's been involving you since the night you were born. There was nothing bitter in her voice. It was simply true, the way geology is true, the way it doesn't matter whether you have feelings about the mountain because the mountain is there. The question is whether we're involved on his terms or ours. Harry looked at the garden, at the tomatoes, at the wall at the end of the garden that had always had the same crack running through it, the same crack he'd sat next to and thought things through since he was 7. Ours, he said. Yes, she said, that's what I thought. They were quiet for a moment. A bird moved through the garden with no apparent purpose. Somewhere in the house Sirius was playing music too loud and Remus was enduring it with the patience of long practice. There's something else, Hermione said. Harry looked at her. The thing Sirius and Remus aren't telling us, it's connected. I don't know how exactly, but the shape of it. She stopped, chose her words carefully. The way Remus has been this summer, the letters he's had, the way Sirius looks when he thinks we're not watching. She turned the notebook over in her hands. I think something's going to happen this year, something we need to be prepared for. Harry thought about it, about Sirius's early mornings and Remus's repeated pages, about the particular quality of protectiveness both of them had been expressing this summer, not the ordinary warmth of it but the active, braced kind. Yeah, he said. I think so too. The thing that happened was Sirius Black escaping from Azkaban. Except Sirius Black had never gone to Azkaban, which meant the thing that happened was the other Sirius Black story, the one that had been moving in parallel with their lives for 12 years in the background, the piece Sirius himself had been sitting with since the night in Bristol, the piece he'd told Harry about at age 9 and had been not quite resolved since. It started on the 2nd of September with a letter in Sirius's handwriting that was shorter than his letters usually were. Harry read it at the Gryffindor breakfast table. Wormtail has been found. Ministry has it wrong. Remus and I are handling it. Don't do anything until we talk. Padfoot. Harry passed it to Hermione. She read it, passed it back, ate a piece of toast and said, define handling it. I don't know yet. He's not going to Azkaban, she said. If the Ministry gets hold of this before Sirius can, before there's a trial, before proper evidence, I know. Peter Pettigrew has been hiding as a rat for 12 years, she said. That is a cold, premeditated, sustained deception. He's going to keep deceiving. Whatever he tells the ministry, it's going to be designed to Hermione. Harry put the letter in his pocket. I know, that's why he said don't do anything. He means he has a plan. Sirius's plans have historically involved motorcycles and improvisation in roughly equal measure. That's not, Harry paused, that's not entirely unfair. He picked up his fork. But Remus is with him. Remus plans. She considered this. True, she picked up her own fork, but I want information. We'll write tonight. Write this morning. I want information by dinner. He wrote that morning between History of Magic, which was Binns at his most soporific, which left considerable time for letter writing and transfiguration, and the response came at dinner in the form of a small folded note that arrived not by owl but by Fawkes, which meant Dumbledore was in this now, and it had escalated past the stage of Sirius handling it with improvisation and charm. The note was from Remus. It said, Peter has been secured, there will be a hearing. The ministry is not fully cooperative. Keep your heads down and let us work. Harry looked at the note, then at Hermione, then at Ron, who'd been watching both of them with the expression of someone who understands that important things are happening and is deciding whether to ask. Keep your heads down, Ron said. That's what it says, Harry agreed. Are you going to? For a reasonable definition of down, Hermione said. The real crisis arrived with Remus's transformations. They'd known about the lycanthropy since they were 5, or rather, Harry had known in some form since he was 5, and Hermione had known in a different form since she was 6, and had read it in Remus's first medical journal that she'd found in the library bookshelf behind Advanced Potion Making, which she'd pulled out not to read it but to find the book behind it, and had accidentally opened to a page of careful personal notes that she'd closed again immediately and put back in the exact position. She'd never told Harry about the journal. She'd just understood what the 1 week a month of Remus's particular tiredness meant, and she'd organized around it, and she'd been careful. What she hadn't known was that the Wolfsbane potion's supply was going to be interrupted. This was Snape's work, not cruelty exactly, more the kind of passive obstruction that operates through non-cooperation. He was Hogwarts potions master, and theoretically responsible for brewing Wolfsbane for Remus, who had been hired by Dumbledore over Snape's quiet objections as defense against the dark arts professor, and in October Snape began delivering the potion late in ways that were technically explainable and practically catastrophic. The defense lessons were the best they'd had. Remus taught defense the way he did everything, with depth and genuine interest, and the understanding that knowledge without application was ornamental. He moved through the curriculum in October and November at a pace that left the class breathless, and Harry sat in the front row with Hermione beside him and felt, for the first time in 3 years, like the subject was being taken seriously by someone who took it seriously. In November, Remus covered Boggarts, and this was the lesson that the third-year students remembered afterward with the particular vividness of things that cost something. The Boggart came out of the wardrobe with the specific efficiency of fear perfectly expressed, and it moved through the class and became spiders for Ron and a disappointed McGonagall for Neville, who dispatched it with a ridiculous and a hat that produced immediate laughter, and then it came to Harry. Boggarts responded to the fear deepest and most immediate, the fear that was the easiest to reach. Harry looked at it and it shifted and became a Dementor, which was accurate in a way because the Dementors on the train in September had done something Harry had not fully reported to anyone. They'd made him hear his mother. He heard her voice every time a Dementor got close enough. The green light and the screaming, and Lily Evans Potter in the last second of her life, choosing love over survival with the particular determined ferocity that everyone who'd known her said was her most defining characteristic. He heard it and it pulled him under in a way nothing else did, not Voldemort's memory in the chamber, not the basilisk, not anything. Remus stepped in front of the Boggart before it fully resolved. Harry appreciated this. Not because he couldn't have dealt with it, but because Remus had understood without being told that this was not the right context for it, that some fears needed to be worked with rather than performed, and the stepping in was itself a kind of teaching. After class, Remus kept Harry back, and Harry sat on the edge of a desk and said, "The Dementors play my mother. I hear her right before." He stopped. Right before Voldemort kills her. Remus looked at him with grey eyes that were doing something complicated. "I should have anticipated that," he said. "I'm sorry. It's not." Harry shook his head. "It's not something I need to be protected from. I need to work with it." He looked at Remus directly. "Can you teach me the Patronus charm?" Remus was quiet for a moment. "It's well above third-year level. I know. It requires accessing a specific quality of happy memory under pressure. Most adult wizards, can we try?" Remus looked at him for a moment longer. "Yes," he said. "After hours, 3 sessions a week. And I want you to know that not producing it immediately is not failure. It's the nature of the charm." "I know," Harry said, "but I'm going to produce it." He said it the way he said things he was certain of, not as a boast but as information, with the calm confidence of someone who knows their own capabilities, and Remus, who had watched Harry build those capabilities for 12 years, believed him completely. The map came from the twins in October. Fred and George had been looking at Harry and Hermione with a certain evaluative quality since September that Harry had clocked and filed. The twins were brilliant and disorganized and operated entirely outside conventional frameworks, and when they evaluated someone, it was because they were deciding something about them. The evaluation concluded in the second week of October in the form of an old piece of parchment pressed into Harry's hand between classes, with Fred saying, "You need this more than we do right now, and we suspect you'll use it better," and George saying, "Just tap it and say, I solemnly swear I'm up to no good," and both of them moving away with the identical self-satisfied expressions of people who have done something good and are not going to explain the full context. He showed Hermione that evening in the common room. She read the entire map, all of it, every corridor and moving dot and name with the focused intensity of someone reading a primary source document, which was exactly what she was doing. Then she sat back. "This is extraordinary magic," she said. "Fred and George found it. They didn't make it." She pointed at the Marauders' inscription at the bottom. "Read the names." Harry read them, then he read them again. He looked up at Hermione. "Moony," she said quietly. "Wormtail, Padfoot, Prongs." Harry looked at the map. "Sirius and Remus," he said, "and my dad." He stopped on the last name, Peter Pettigrew. "The four of them made this together." Hermione traced the inscription with one finger. "This is what the Marauders were. This is the evidence of it." Harry looked at the map for a long moment. At the network of passages and classrooms and corridors that his father and godfather and Remus had mapped together when they were students in this castle. The secret passages, the hidden rooms, the shortcut under the Whomping Willow, he found that one and registered what it meant. "The Shrieking Shack," he said. "Yes," Hermione said. "I think that's relevant." The passage under the willow was relevant approximately a month later, when the things Sirius and Remus had been not quite telling them all summer finally arrived in full. Peter Pettigrew, it emerged, had been at Hogwarts all year. He'd been Scabbers, Ron's rat, 12 years a rat, 12 years hiding in plain sight in the one place connected to the Marauders where nobody would think to look because nobody knew to look, and the people who might have were not in a position to check. Sirius had known Peter was hiding as an animagus. He'd known for 12 years, from the evidence he'd assembled that terrible night in Bristol, and had been working with Remus over the summer to get the Ministry to acknowledge the possibility of an unregistered animagus, which the Ministry had been resistant to because it required them to admit a 12-year-old wrongful imprisonment of a different kind. The night it came together started with Ron's rat going missing in November, which Ron reported with the combination of relief and guilt specific to someone who had not particularly liked their pet and now felt bad about its disappearance, and Harry reading the map that evening and finding a dot labeled Peter Pettigrew moving through the castle corridors with the deliberate speed of something running. Harry showed it to Hermione. She looked at the dot. She looked at Harry. "He's been here the whole time," Harry said. "Yes, at Hogwarts, with us." His voice was controlled in the way it had been when he'd been in the chamber, not cold exactly, but stripped of everything except what was necessary for the next few minutes. "He was here while the basilisk was loose. He was here when he stopped." "I know," Hermione said. "Where is he going?" She looked at the map. "The Whomping Willow, the passage." She looked up. "Sirius is in Hogsmeade. The staff list shows Lupin in the castle. If Peter is running, he's running from something or to something," Harry said. "Or he knows about the passage and he's going somewhere safe." She stood up. "We need Remus." They went to Remus's office at a pace that the castle's staircases, in the arbitrary way they sometimes demonstrated apparent sympathy, arranged helpfully. Remus was at his desk with the wolfsbane complication written all over the quality of his evening. The full moon was 3 days away and the potion had been late again, which meant he was managing a low-level constant effort that Harry had learned to read across a room. Harry put the map on the desk. "Peter Pettigrew is in the castle and he's heading for the passage under the Whomping Willow." Remus looked at the map and went very still. "How do you have this?" he said. "Fred and George." Harry didn't move. "You made it, you and Sirius and my dad and Peter." Remus looked at the dot moving on the map. When he looked up, his face had done the thing it did when the two registers of Remus, the careful, measured academic and the man who had run with wolves and knew how to act in the moment something was actually happening, resolved in the second register's favor. "Stay here," he said. "No," Harry said. Remus looked at him. "He's been in this castle all year," Harry said, with the complete, quiet certainty that was one of his most consistent qualities, the thing that had been true of him since he was old enough to formulate it. "He betrayed my parents. He's been at Hogwarts with me and Hermione for 3 months. I'm not staying here." The office was very quiet. Remus looked at Harry for a moment with an expression that had layers, grief in it, and pride, and the particular anguish of a man who knows the person in front of him is right and wishes they weren't. "Close to me," Remus said. "Both of you, you do not go ahead of me. If Peter is running, it's because he's frightened, and frightened animagi are dangerous and small." "Understood," Hermione said, and Harry nodded. They went through the castle and out onto the grounds in November cold, Remus in front, Harry and Hermione a half-step behind, the map in Harry's hand tracking the dot that was now stationary under the willow, which meant the passage. The willow was managed by Remus with a long stick and knowledge of the knot that froze it, and then the three of them went into the passage single file with their wands lit, moving at speed. The Shrieking Shack smelled like old wood and cold and something animal, and it was dark, and in the far corner, caught in the light of 3 wands, was a very small man with patchy grey hair and a pointed face who looked at them with the darting, desperate eyes of something that has been cornered and knows it. "Peter," Remus said. Peter Pettigrew opened his mouth. What came out was a performance, voice cracking, hands raised, eyes going to Harry with a calculated pathos that was so precisely calibrated to the emotions of the moment that Harry recognized it immediately as exactly what it was. "Harry," Peter said, "you have to understand I had no choice. Voldemort would have killed me. I was trying to protect James and Lily. I was trying to—" "Don't," Harry said. Peter stopped. Harry looked at him. Not with the rage that Peter had been calculating for. The rage was the thing he'd been planning to work with, the hot emotion of a 13-year-old confronting the man who'd betrayed his parents, the thing that could be redirected and used. Harry wasn't giving him that. He looked at Peter Pettigrew with something much harder to manage, which was simple, clear assessment. "You've had 12 years to come forward," Harry said. "Every day was a choice. You chose 12 years of those days." He looked at Peter's hands, which were trembling with what was either genuine fear or an excellent simulation. "You're going to come back to the castle with us. You're going to give a testimony. And if the ministry does what it should, Sirius is going to be formally cleared of a crime he was never charged with because you ran before anyone could charge anyone with anything." Peter's eyes had gone calculating again, the fear shading into something else. "I could disapparate," he said. You could," Harry agreed. "And we'd find you. It might take a while, but we'd find you." He paused. "Or you could come now and give your testimony and possibly live the rest of your life without looking over your shoulder. That option closes in approximately the next 30 seconds. Remus looked at Harry with an expression that he would not have been able to fully articulate, but that contained enormous volumes. Peter came. Sirius arrived at the Shrieking Shack entrance just as they emerged. He'd tracked the map he had a copy of, the original that he'd kept for 12 years, and he'd come from Hogsmeade at a run, and when he saw Peter in the grip of Remus's binding spell with Harry and Hermione flanking him, he stopped in the moonlit night and looked at Peter Pettigrew for a long moment. Peter looked back. The calculation was still there, but there was something else too, something that might have been relief. The relief of someone who has been running for 12 years and has finally at last stopped. Sirius stepped forward. Harry moved between them. It wasn't that he didn't trust Sirius. He trusted Sirius completely. It was that he knew exactly what Sirius was feeling in this moment, and he knew what that feeling could do to 12 years of careful evidence building, and he put himself in the space between them with the specific authority of someone who has thought about this more recently than the other person. "He's more useful alive," Harry said, quietly, directly, just to Sirius. "And you don't want to do that, not really." Sirius looked at Harry. His face was doing too many things to read cleanly, but his eyes were clear and entirely present, and he was breathing through something that took effort. "You sound like Moony," Sirius said. "Moony's right here," Harry said. Sirius looked over Harry's shoulder at Remus, who was watching with the particular attentiveness of someone who knows both men in this situation as well as he knows himself. Then Sirius looked back at Harry, something in his face resolved. "All right," he said, "we take him in." The hearing was in December, requested by Sirius through Dumbledore's intervention, and held in the Ministry with an aura present and the testimony recorded by a magical transcription quill that took down every word of Peter Pettigrew's carefully incomplete and strategically self-serving account. It wasn't everything. Peter gave them enough to establish the basic truth and kept the details that would most damage him vague, but it was enough. It was enough because Sirius had 12 years of assembled evidence, because Remus had written testimony about animagus registration and the physical evidence of Peter's continued existence, because Hermione had spent 2 days before the hearing identifying the specific evidentiary gaps in the Ministry's original conclusion and writing a 14-page brief that a senior aura read and then reread and then looked up from with an expression that was not comfortable. The hearing took 6 hours. Formal clearance came 3 weeks later in a letter that Sirius opened at the kitchen table on a Monday morning and read twice and then set down very carefully on the table next to his tea. Harry looked at his face. "It's done," Sirius said. Harry reached over and put his hand over Sirius's, not saying anything, just the fact of it. Sirius turned his hand over and gripped Harry's for a moment, then let go and picked up his tea and said in a voice that was nearly completely steady, "Right. We should have something for breakfast that isn't toast." "You've been saying that for 12 years, Remus said, "and yet we always have toast." "We have toast because you burn everything else," Hermione said. "That is actually true," Sirius said, "but not today. Today I'm making eggs." Remus, take notes. The Patronus Charm sessions with Remus ran through October and November in the evenings after dinner in the defense office with the desks pushed back. Harry worked at it with the methodical persistence that characterized his approach to anything he decided to learn, not anxious about it, not performing effort for an audience, just working through it the way you work through a broom technique, finding the shape of what was required and building toward it. The happy memory was the challenge, not because he lacked happy memories. 12 years of Grimmauld Place had built him a library of them, but because the Patronus required something beyond ordinary happiness. It required the specific quality of joy that was so complete it could hold against the cold pull of despair, and finding the right memory was the work. He tried Grimmauld Place in summer, not quite enough. He tried a Quidditch catch in October of his first year, the first snitch Gryffindor exploding around him. Closer. He tried, and here he was careful, deliberate, choosing deliberately, the night in the hospital wing at the end of second year, when Hermione had woken up and the relief on her face when she'd found him there had been so complete and so unguarded that it had sat in his memory ever since like something luminous. The patronus that came from that memory on the third attempt was a fully corporeal stag. It stood in the defense office in the silver light of the spell and looked at Remus with Lily's eyes, which were Harry's eyes, and it was enormous and entirely itself, and Remus stood very still for a moment and then sat down on the edge of his desk and looked at it until it faded. Harry lowered his wand. He looked at Remus. "Your father's animagus form," Remus said quietly. "I know," Harry said. "The memory," Remus said, not quite asking. Harry thought about it. "Something important," he said. "That I knew was important when it happened." Remus looked at him with the layered attention he brought to Harry specifically. He didn't push. He never pushed. It was one of the things that made him Remus, the understanding that some knowledge belongs to the person who has it and becomes different when it's shared, and that the sharing should be the person's choice. "It's a remarkable patronus for a 13-year-old, Remus said finally. "It's a remarkable memory," Harry said. The Dementor incident on the Quidditch pitch happened in November, which was 3 days after Sirius's formal clearance and 1 week before Peter's sentencing. And it was the most severe exposure Harry had had. 3 Dementors, not one, converging from the east end of the pitch where they'd stationed during the storm, drawn by the emotional intensity of a Quidditch match in cold rain, and triggered into action by something that felt to Harry like deliberate provocation. He fell 60 feet off his nimbus, which the Whomping Willow was already consuming, and he had the Dementors and his mother's voice and the cold and the memory coming apart in his hands all at the same time, and it should have been the worst moment of the year except that the patronus was there before he consciously produced it. The stag already burning between him and the Dementors with all the force of the memory behind it, and it was Hermione's patronus, a bolt of light. Different in form but identical in temperature, fierce and precise, that hit the 4th Dementor he hadn't registered on his left side. He landed on the pitch, soft mud. Ron was there immediately and the team, and then Hermione running from the Gryffindor stand with her wand drawn and an expression that he would later describe to Sirius as exactly like McGonagall except more alarming. She crouched next to him. "The patronus," she said. "The one on the left, was that yours?" he said. She looked at him. "I wasn't near you, I was in the stands." "I know," he said, "I know where you were." They looked at each other in the rain on the Quidditch pitch with the Dementors retreating and the Whomping Willow digesting his broomstick, and the thing that passed between them in that moment was not surprise. It was the recognition of something that had been building for a long time and had finally crossed a threshold. "The bond," she said. "Yeah," he said. "I felt you fall," she said. Her voice was steady and precise, and underneath it was something that was absolutely not steady. "I felt it before I saw it, like something," she stopped, chose the word, "like something essential tipping." Harry looked at her. "Are you all right?" She made a face that was specifically the face of someone who has been frightened and is now processing it through irritation. "I'm fine. You fell 60 feet, and you caught me with a patronus from the stands." "Technically, the patronus pushed the Dementor before it could interfere with your landing," she said. "You still fell. The mud caught you." "Semantics. Accurate." She offered her hand. He took it and she pulled him up, and for a moment they were standing very close together in the rain, and she didn't immediately step back and he didn't immediately let go of her hand, and Ron arrived and looked at them and then very pointedly looked at the remains of the nimbus. "Sirius is going to need to know about the broom," Ron said. "I know," Harry said. "He's going to be upset." "About the broom or about the Dementors?" "Probably the order it happened in," Hermione said, "rather than the events individually. The patronus charm, it turned out, operated through the bond at range when the emotional trigger was sufficient." This was the information Remus added to his notebook in November, in the section titled Soulbond Documented Behaviors, which now covered 14 pages, and had developed from theoretical to empirical with a thoroughness that Remus found both scientifically fascinating and personally complicated, because the science was inseparable from the 2 specific people he loved, and the 2 specific people were 13 years old. And what the science described had significant implications for what they were going to become. He wrote up his findings carefully and sent a copy to Dumbledore with a cover letter that was 2 pages long and noted, in its final paragraph, that in his professional and personal assessment, the bond between Harry Potter and Hermione Granger was developing ahead of documented historical timelines, that its current expressions were entirely within healthy parameters, and that any attempt to manage or direct its development from outside would be counterproductive. He underlined counterproductive once and then, after consideration, underlined it twice. Dumbledore's reply was 1 line: "Your assessment confirms my own. I trust your continued judgment on this matter." The end of term approached with Sirius's clearance confirmed and Peter's sentencing scheduled for January, and the particular relief of a year that had started with threat and was ending with resolution. Harry wrote Sirius a letter on the second to last day of term that described the patronus in detail, the memory, the form, the pitch incident, and sent it with Hedwig, who had been waiting with the impatience of an owl who preferred being in motion. Sirius's reply came back the same afternoon, which meant he'd been waiting. The letter said, "Your father's form. Of course it is. Of course it bloody is. I'm sitting here in the kitchen crying into my tea, and Remus is pretending not to notice and doing a very poor job. The memory, I'm not going to ask, but I think I know. Some things you recognize without being told. P.S. I'm buying you a new broom, don't argue, it's not optional. P.P.S. Tell Hermione from me that she did exactly right, and that the distance at which she cast it is, by the way, extraordinary." Harry read the letter twice and then folded it and put it in his trunk with the other letters Sirius had written him over 3 years, which were in a stack held together with a piece of string that he'd tied himself when the stack got too big to sit neatly, and he sat on the edge of his bed in the Gryffindor dormitory and felt something that had no clean name but that was warm and complete and a little overwhelming and entirely good. Hermione knocked on the dormitory door. "Train leaves in 2 hours, she said. "Have you packed?" "Working on it." She came in with the specific confidence of someone who had long since decided that the gendered compartmentalization of dormitory spaces was a convention she had no interest in, and she sat on the bed next to him and looked at the stack of letters. "He wrote," she said, "this afternoon." Harry handed her the letter. She read it. Her expression did the thing where it moved through several things quickly and then settled on one. She set the letter down and was quiet for a moment. "He says to tell you the distance was extraordinary," Harry said. "I know, I read it," she said. "I'm thinking about the other part, the bit about me knowing without being told." "Yes." She looked at the dormitory window, which showed December grey and the top of the Hogwarts grounds covered in light frost. "Things are different this year," she said. "From last year, I mean, we're different." "Yeah," Harry said. "The Patronus, what happened on the pitch, the distance." She was being precise, which was how she handled things that were real and large and not yet fully resolved in her own thinking. "I've been reading everything Remus has written about the bond, the papers he's published and the ones he hasn't." "How did you get the unpublished ones?" "He doesn't hide them very well." Hermione. "They were in the library at home," she said, entirely unapologetically. "In the shelf behind the reference texts. I've known they were there for 2 years. She looked at him. "I wanted to understand what we are." Harry looked at her. She was looking back at him with the directness she brought to things that mattered, the dark eyes steady and clear, and the afternoon light was doing something to the way she looked that he noticed and decided not to think about specifically right now. "What did you find?" he said. "That it's not a constraint," she said. "It's not something imposed on us. Every text frames it as though it's the bond doing something to the people, pushing them toward each other, controlling the direction of it. But I don't think that's right." She paused. "I think the bond reflects what's already there. I think it grew from something real, not the other way around. The magic didn't create the attachment created the magic." Harry thought about this for a long moment. Outside, the frost on the grounds was catching the last grey light, and the castle below them was settling into its end-of-term quiet. Students packing and moving through corridors, the specific holiday energy of a place preparing to empty. "That makes it better," he said. "Yes," she said. "I thought so too." They sat side by side on the edge of the bed in the quiet dormitory with the stack of letters between them and the window showing December, and neither of them said anything else for a while. There was a specific kind of silence that lived between people who know each other well enough that the silence doesn't need filling. The silence isn't absence, it's presence, it has texture and weight, it's the space where everything that's already understood lives without needing to be said again. Eventually Hermione said, 2 hours. "Right," Harry said. "Pack your trunk." "I will." She stood up and went to the door, and then she stopped with her back to him and said, "Harry." "Yeah." "The memory you used for the Patronus," she said. "I think I know what it was." He waited. "I'm not going to ask," she said. I think I know." A pause. Her voice was very steady, which meant it was costing her something. "And if I'm right, then thank you for using it." Harry looked at the back of her head, at the mess of her hair catching the winter light, at the straightness of her shoulders, at the way she stood when something mattered, which was the same way she stood when she was working through a difficult problem with complete presence, giving it everything. "You'd have used it too," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded once and went down the stairs, and Harry sat in the dormitory for another full minute before he started packing. On the Hogwarts Express going home, Ron ate every cauldron cake on the trolley and conducted a detailed strategic analysis of Gryffindor's Quidditch season, and Hermione read, and Harry watched the winter countryside go past the window, and Neville described in excellent detail the various ways his grandmother had responded to the news about his boggart, which was a ridiculous of her hat producing a magnificent vulture, and outside the window England went grey and cold toward London. At King's Cross on the platform, Sirius was waiting with his hands in his pockets and Remus at his shoulder, and they were both looking at the train doors with the particular quality of people who have been waiting and know they won't have to wait much longer. Harry came through the barrier. Sirius straightened. Hermione was a half step behind him, as she usually was, as she had been for 12 years in one form or another, and she saw the same thing. Harry saw 2 men on a platform at the end of a year that had given all 4 of them something large to carry and had ended at last in something like resolution. Sirius crossed the distance and pulled Harry into his arms with the same brief, fierce grip as every reunion, and Harry held on a second longer than usual, and Sirius let him. Formal clearance is in January, Sirius said into Harry's hair. Moony got a letter yesterday, it's actually happening. I know, Harry said. I'm glad. Sirius released him. He looked at Hermione over Harry's shoulder and she looked back at him, and they had their own version of the conversation that didn't need words, the one that had been running between them since she was 18 months old and had put her hand on his face in a wrecked nursery and decided to trust him. He reached over and tucked her hair back from her face in the gesture that was entirely his own. You cast a patroness from the Quidditch stands, he said. Yes, she said. How far? Approximately 80 feet. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, your mum would have thought that was extraordinary. Something crossed Hermione's face that was quick and genuine and gone before it could be examined. She nodded. Remus picked up both their trunks without being asked, which was his consistent way of showing up for things, practical, quiet, present, and they walked through King's Cross together in the December crowd, the four of them moving in the loose, comfortable formation they'd been moving in for years, the one that had no official structure but always resolved the same way. Harry and Hermione naturally close, Sirius and Remus flanking, the whole arrangement easy with long practice. Outside the station the cold hit properly, December sharp and clear, and London stretched in every direction with its noise and its crowds and its accumulated ordinary life, and Sirius tilted his face up at the sky for a moment and said, Right, Christmas, I'm making dinner. You're not making dinner, Remus said. I'm making a contribution to dinner. Define contribution, the part that doesn't involve the stove. Harry and Hermione fell into step together and did not discuss the fact that their shoulders were touching. The city moved around them and the year moved behind them, and ahead was Grimmauld Place and the kitchen table and the fire in the sitting room and biscuits that would run out too fast and books that would be borrowed without asking and everything else that had built itself into the structure of what they were to each other. The patroness had been a stag. The memory had been a hospital wing and relief so complete it was physical, and a girl opening her eyes and not looking around the room before she found him because she already knew he was there. Hermione knew. Harry had known she knew since the dormitory. Some things, as Sirius had noted, you recognize without being told. Chapter 6. The graveyard and the choice fourth year arrived the way consequential years tend to, without announcement, ordinary on the surface, the summer at Grimmauld Place running its familiar patterns until the patterns shifted in ways that were hard to name until later. The Quidditch World Cup was the first shift. Sirius got tickets through a contact at the ministry whose name he declined to specify, and they went, all four of them, plus Ron and the Weasleys, the two groups merging at the campsite with the comfortable ease of families who have established genuine friendship across 3 years of shared Hogwarts loyalties. Arthur Weasley shook Sirius's hand with the warm enthusiasm of a man who'd followed the clearance hearing closely and had strong opinions about ministry misconduct, and Molly Weasley pulled Harry into a hug that was so complete it briefly obscured his entire face, and then turned to Hermione with the same warmth and the particular softness she reserved for children without mothers, which Hermione received with the gracious composure of someone who knew what it was and appreciated it without needing it. Island 1. Crumb caught the snitch at the wrong moment, which was tactically strange and which Harry discussed with Ron for the entire walk back to the campsite with the focused intensity of two people who find strategic errors genuinely interesting. The Death Eaters came after midnight. Harry had been almost asleep in the tent when the noise started, distant at first, then close, then very close, the sounds of panic and spellfire and something that felt like coordinated action rather than mob behavior. He was on his feet and had his wand before he was fully awake, which was what 3 years of Remus's defense lessons and Sirius's unconventional training had built into his reflexes. Sirius was already up. He looked at Harry across the tent with the flat, focused look he got when something real was happening. Stay together, he said. Remus, take the east side of the camp. Harry, Hermione, with me. The Muggle family, Hermione said immediately. She'd clocked them that afternoon, a Muggle couple the ministry had obliviated into thinking they were at an ordinary camping holiday, waving at their neighbors with bemused friendliness. They're in the path, left tent 40 meters, Sirius said. He'd clocked them too. Go. They moved through the panicking crowd, not with it but across it, reading the flow, finding the spaces. This was something Harry and Hermione had discussed theoretically in the library, and were now discovering they'd actually internalized: how to navigate chaotic movement without becoming part of the chaos, how to keep a destination fixed when everything around it was in motion. Sirius moved like someone who had done this before, which he had, and Harry moved like Sirius had taught him, and Hermione moved like someone who had planned for 12 contingencies and was currently on contingency 3. They got the Muggle family out. Sirius handled the situation with the specific authority of a man who looked in a crisis exactly like the kind of person you listened to, and the family moved and they got clear, and from the hill above the campsite Harry watched the dark mark rise green and serpentine in the sky over the forest, and felt the particular cold of something returning. Nobody was killed that night. Which was, as Sirius noted on the walk back, both better than it could have been and not as good as it should have been, and both of those things were worth holding simultaneously. The Triwizard Tournament announcement came in September, and Harry read about it in the letter from Sirius that arrived with the school year in the same envelope as the usual first-week letter, which meant Sirius had known before they did and had thoughts. The letter said, "Watch the tournament, watch who enters, watch who wants you to enter. 3 schools, 1 champion each, except there will be 4 and you'll know when it's coming, and by that point you should already have a good sense of the shape of what it is. Don't enter unless you're choosing to. Don't let anyone tell you that you have to. P.S. Send me everything you observe about the new defense professor, everything." Harry showed it to Hermione, who read it twice and said, "He already knows something." "He usually does," Harry said. "The last line," she said. "The defense professor." "He knows who it is." "Mad-Eye Moody," Harry said. "His name's been announced. He and Sirius were in the order together." Hermione thought about this. "Then the warning is specific." She looked at the letter. "He's saying watch Moody." "Which is interesting," Harry said, "because Moody's whole thing is constant vigilance." "Yes," Hermione said, "which is either consistent with the warning or the best possible cover for ignoring it." Moody was, in the event, genuinely extraordinary to watch. He taught defense the way it was supposed to be taught, practically, without apology, with a directness that stripped away the performative fear most defense teachers wrapped the subject in. He demonstrated the unforgivable curses in class, and Harry watched them with the absolute attention of someone for whom these curses were not abstract historical categories but personal history. And he did not flinch, and neither did Hermione, which Moody noticed, and which seemed to adjust something in his assessment of both of them. The false eye moved constantly and caught everything. That was the thing about Moody. The constant vigilance wasn't performance, it was necessity, and watching it made Harry thoughtful in ways he didn't fully articulate until later. The Goblet of Fire appeared in October with the tournament announcement formal and complete, and the buzz of it moved through Hogwarts for a week like something electric running through stone. Harry and Hermione discussed it once clearly at the kitchen table of Grimmauld Place during the October Hogsmeade weekend that they'd spent at home instead. "Are you going to enter?" Hermione asked. "No," Harry said. "I'm 14. The age restriction exists for good reasons and I don't need the tournament." "What would you need it for?" "To prove something," he said, "and I don't need to prove anything." He looked at her across the table with the straightforward certainty that had always been his most distinctive quality. "The question isn't whether I could compete. The question is whether it's worth the risk for reasons that don't hold up when I look at them." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was, briefly and completely, warm in the way she was warm when she wasn't being careful about it. "Remus will be pleased you put it that way." "Remus put it that way first," Harry said. "I'm just agreeing with the analysis." "You're agreeing with it because it's right." "That too." When Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire on the night of the selection, the Great Hall went completely silent for 2 full seconds before the noise crashed in. Harry sat in his seat and looked at the parchment in Dumbledore's hand and felt 2 things simultaneously: the cold recognition that this was what Sirius's letter had been about, and the bone certainty of Hermione's presence on his left, which was not physical in the obvious sense but which pulled taut in the way it did when something significant was happening. He stood up. Because there was nothing else to do, refusing would not help anything, and walking to the front of the room in the full visibility of a school that was staring at him told him things about the staring that were useful. He walked steadily. He didn't look alarmed, he looked, if anything, interested. Hermione watched him go with her hands flat on the table and her face doing the precise, rapid calculation of someone identifying all available information. In the anteroom with Cedric and Fleur and Victor Crumb, Harry looked at Dumbledore and said simply, "I didn't put my name in." Dumbledore looked at him. "I know," he said. "Then someone else did, someone who knew I'd be bound by it once it was selected." "Yes, that's a trap," Harry said. "Yes," Dumbledore said again, and the weight of it, the way he said it with the patience of a man who'd already been sitting with this knowledge and was confirming it rather than discovering it, told Harry several things about how long this had been in motion. "How dangerous is it?" Harry asked, not anxiously, practically. "Extremely," Dumbledore said. "I will not mislead you about that." "Right," Harry said. "I need to talk to Sirius." The conversation with Sirius that night via Flu lasted 40 minutes and moved through several stages. Sirius listened to everything, then he said, "Mad-Eye Moody." Still watching him, Harry said. "Watch harder." Sirius paused. "The tournament is a means to an end. Someone wants you at the end of it. Think about what the end of the tournament is." "The final task," Harry said. "The champions are taken somewhere, a portkey." "If you could turn anything in the final task into a portkey," Sirius said, "you could take the winner anywhere." Harry looked at the fireplace. The fire was low and green and Sirius's face in it was focused. "They need me to win," Harry said, "or at least to reach the final task. They need me to get to the end." "Yes," Sirius said, "which means between now and then you're more useful to them alive and succeeding." "Cold comfort, cold strategy," Sirius said. "Use it." Hermione had reached the same conclusion independently by morning. She appeared at breakfast with a notebook that had 3 pages of new notes and the expression of someone who had been awake since 5, and she sat down next to Harry and said, "Portkey, final task, someone needs you at the end of it." "I know," Harry said. She looked at him. "Moody's been too helpful." "I know." His eye can see through almost anything, through walls, through invisibility cloaks. He should have seen who put your name in the goblet. I know, Harry said, which means either he didn't see it or he did. She held his gaze. He's not moody. The certainty in her voice was the certainty of someone who has run the logic to its conclusion and found it clean. Harry had been circling the same conclusion for a week. Hearing her say it made it solid. No, he said, he's not. Polyjuice potion, she said. Someone with access to the real Moody, enough time with him to maintain the deception for an academic year. She paused. It's elegant, actually, in a terrible way. Voldemort's people, Harry said. Yes, she turned a page in her notebook. The question is who and where the real Moody is and what the plan is for the night of the final task. I need to survive 3 tasks first, Harry said. We need to survive 3 tasks first, she said with a precision that brooked no argument. I'm not watching from the stands for 3 of them. Harry looked at her. The champions compete alone, that's the rule. The rule is that each school has 1 champion, she said. There's nothing in the tournament charter about the champions' preparation or who assists them with research and strategy outside the tasks themselves. She looked at him steadily. You're not competing alone. You're competing as the face of it, and I'm the entire rest of the operation. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then, obviously, he said, the first task was dragons. Harry figured it out a day early because Sirius's contact in the ministry still undisclosed, and Harry had stopped asking, sent a cryptic letter that contained the word Horntail and a brief note that said Sirius says you know what to do with a broomstick. He told Hermione and Cedric, because telling Cedric was simply the right thing to do with information that meant the difference between fair and unfair competition, and Cedric received it with the surprised grace of someone who didn't expect the gesture and recognized its quality. He told only Hermione the full plan. The Horntail was huge and old, and had the specific fury of something whose eggs were in danger, which Harry respected even as he was getting on his broom and flying above it with the focused speed of someone who understood that the goal was not to defeat the dragon, but to get past it while it was looking somewhere else. He got the golden egg. The crowd made the kind of noise that resonated in the chest. He landed in front of the judges' table and Hermione was already at the edge of the champion's enclosure, and the expression on her face when he landed, the specific combination of relief and something that was very close to fury and was actually just fear that had converted itself, as her fears usually did, into energy, was something he filed in the same place as the hospital wing memory. The plan worked, he said. The plan worked, she agreed with the satisfaction of someone confirming a hypothesis. Then your left hand, he looked at it, a shallow burn from a near miss with a flame. It's fine. It's not fine, it needs Hermione. Stop saying my name in that tone and let Madame Pomfrey look at the hand, she said. He let Madame Pomfrey look at the hand. The second task was the lake, and what was taken from each champion was the thing they'd miss most. When Harry came up for air the first time and saw Ron in the water and not Hermione, something moved through him that was fast and cold and over before he could name it. Ron was what Harry would miss most, that was what the task had assessed, and it was true. Ron was his first real friend and that mattered completely, except it wasn't what Harry would miss most. He dove back down and completed the task, and brought Ron up and waited while Fleur's sister and Cedric's girlfriend and Victor Crumb came up. And then he looked at the surface of the lake for a moment, and thought about the fact that the task had identified Ron, and thought about what that meant about the nature of the assessment, and thought about what the honest answer would have been to a more accurate question. He thought about it for approximately 30 seconds, and then set it aside because there were more urgent things, and he would come back to it later. He came back to it 2 days before the final task, which was a maze. He and Hermione had spent the weeks between the second and third tasks doing 3 things: preparing for the maze, continuing to watch Moody with the careful attention of people who couldn't let on that they were watching, and for Harry, specifically, sitting with something he'd been articulate about to himself for a while, and hadn't found the right moment for outside his own head. The evening 2 days before the task they were in the library together, which was where they usually were when they were working, and Hermione was cross-referencing maze navigation theory with known magical hazards, and Harry was supposed to be doing the same thing but had been looking at the same page for 12 minutes without reading it. Hermione noticed, because she noticed everything. She looked up from her book and looked at him in the way she had when something needed to be said, and she was waiting to see if he was going to say it first. Harry set the book down. The second task, he said, what they took. She looked at him steadily, not performing calm, actually calm, or something close enough to it to function the same way. I know what they took, she said. They took Ron, Harry said. That's what the assessment found, what I'd miss most. I know, she said, quiet. But I've been thinking about it, Harry said, and I think the assessment was wrong. He looked at her directly, the same directness that had been his most consistent quality since he was old enough to have qualities. Or I think I'd been wrong about what I knew and the assessment caught what I believed at the time and not what's actually true. The library was empty. Late evening, the torches burning low, the dark outside the windows and the smell of old books and the specific intimate quality of a space where serious things could be said. Hermione's expression had done the thing where several things moved through it quickly. She set her own book down with the careful deliberateness of someone making space. "I know," she said again, but differently this time. The same two words, different weight. "You know," Harry said. "I think I've known for a while," she said. Not as a performance of certainty, there was something genuinely careful in it, something honest about the difficulty of knowing. "I've been thinking about the Patronus and the pitch and the hospital wing at the end of second year." She paused, "and first year and every time in between." She looked at her hands on the table. "I've been very thorough about thinking about it." "And," Harry said. She looked up. "And I'm not afraid of it," she said. "I was for a while, not of you, of the size of it. Of what it meant." She held his gaze with complete steadiness. "But I'm not afraid of it anymore." Harry looked at her. The girl he'd known since before he could remember knowing anyone. The person who'd been beside him in every room that mattered. The one whose absence during second year had produced in him not grief but something colder and more purposeful, a fury so organized it had walked him into the chamber with a sword and come back out. The one whose Patronus had come across 80 feet because the bond ran on something real. "It's not the bond," he said. "I mean it is, but it's not just the bond. It was real before the bond was something we knew about. The bond grew from it." "That's what you said." "That's what I believe," she said. "Yes, so do I," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said with the specific practical warmth that was entirely her own, "We have a maze to survive in 2 days." "I know," Harry said, "and whatever is waiting at the end of it. I know, so this conversation," she stopped, started again. "I want to have this conversation properly, all of it, not in the middle of everything. After." "After," he agreed. She nodded once. Then she picked up her book and found her place, and Harry picked up his book and actually read the page this time, and they sat in the library in the quiet evening and worked. And under the working was the thing they'd said, sitting between them, warm and patient and entirely certain of itself. The night of the final task was June and warm, and the whole school in the stands, and the maze standing at the edge of the Quidditch pitch dark and enormous. Harry stood at the entrance with Cedric to his right, and the full weight of what he knew sitting in his chest, not fear, not exactly, but the complete alertness of someone who knows what's coming and has prepared for it as much as preparation is possible. Hermione was in the stands. He knew exactly where without looking. The bond was a constant low frequency at the best of times, and tonight it was not low. It had been running at an elevated pitch since morning, the way it did when both of them were processing something significant, and it was the clearest it had ever been, which was either because of what they'd said in the library or because of what was coming or because both things were the same current. He looked at the stands once before going in. Found her face immediately, dark eyes and steady expression, and she looked back at him with the complete attention she brought to things that mattered, and what passed between them was not words and not the bond exactly and not anything that needed a name. He went into the maze. The maze was genuinely dangerous and entirely uninterested in being fair. There were blast-ended scroots, which were as terrible as their reputation, and a boggart in the third junction that took the form of Hermione lying motionless on a stone floor, which Harry dealt with in 2 seconds through sheer refusal, ridiculous before the image could fully resolve, before it could become something he'd have to carry out with him, and a stretch of ground that tried to swallow him, and a sphinx who asked a riddle that he solved by thinking about what Hermione would say. Which was that riddles always told you more about the riddler than they seemed to. He found Cedric in the 4th section, injured by a spell he'd taken from the false Moody earlier in the year, and now caught in something the maze itself had conjured. Harry could have left him. The logic of competition was clear. He got him free without discussing it because that was simply who he was. They reached the Triwizard Cup together. "Together," Cedric said. Harry looked at the cup. He looked at Cedric. He thought about what was waiting. "Take it," Harry said. "Just you." Cedric looked at him. "That's not—" "I know what that cup is," Harry said quietly. "It's a portkey. I don't know where it goes, but I know it's a trap and I know it's built for me." He held Cedric's gaze. "You take it, you win properly. I'll deal with whoever set the trap." Cedric looked at him for a long moment. "You're certain?" "Yes." Cedric reached for the cup and something pulled. Not the cup, the something was inside Harry's chest, the thing that had been running at elevated pitch all night, the bond, and it pulled with a force that was nothing like the background hum of the library or the pitch or the ordinary texture of every day. It pulled the way it had pulled Harry across 40 miles of countryside when he was 1 year old and Hermione was in danger. The cup vanished. Cedric was holding it. He was gone. And Hermione was in the maze. She appeared at the junction behind him at a run, one drawn, and she looked at him, and the look said everything about what had happened in the stands. She'd felt the pull too, the same pull, and she had not sat in the stands and waited for it. "The cup's gone," Harry said. "I know," she said, not breathing hard, having run through a maze in dress robes without apparent concern. "I felt something's wrong. Where does it go?" "I don't know," he said. "But I know who set the trap, and I know it goes somewhere Voldemort can reach, and I know Cedric is there right now, and I know what I have to do." He looked at her. He was not going to tell her to stay. She would not stay, and he did not want her to, and the bond between them was not a leash in either direction. Together, she was already looking at the maze entrance, calculating. "We need another portkey to follow. Something that's been where the cup went, or you can make a tracking portkey," Harry said. "From the residual magic, third-year spell, Remus taught it in January." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this?" "Since October," he said. She picked up a stone from the maze floor and performed the tracking portkey charm with the precise confidence of someone who had practiced it and knew exactly what she was doing. And the stone glowed faintly with the residual signature of the cup's departure, and she held it out and Harry put his hand over hers and they took the portkey together. The graveyard was exactly what graveyards were at midnight, cold and dark and very quiet. The quiet was the first thing. Then the smell, old stone and cut grass and something chemical underneath it. Then the figure on the ground 20 feet away. Cedric was alive, stunned not dead, and Harry registered this with enormous relief and the immediate secondary recognition that Cedric being alive meant the plan had deviated. Either Cedric's presence was unexpected or whoever had set this had decided one witness was manageable. Then the other figure. Small, moving, wrapped in a robe that was too large, moving toward a large stone cauldron at the center of the graveyard with the deliberate speed of something that had been planning this for a very long time. Wormtail, Harry said. Hermione's hand closed on his arm. She'd recognized it too. Peter Pettigrew looked up. He looked at Harry. He looked at Hermione. Something moved through his face, not surprise, because surprise would mean he hadn't planned for this, but adjustment, rapid and practiced, the recalculation of someone who'd spent 12 years recalculating. You weren't supposed to be here, Peter said to Hermione. And yet, she said, the ritual. Peter stopped. His eyes went to Harry. It only needs Potter, the bone, the blood, the flesh. Don't, Harry said. Peter's wand was already up. He was fast, faster than he looked, the speed of something that had survived by reflex for 12 years, and the binding curse hit Harry and Hermione both, a wide-angle cast designed for 2 targets, and they hit the ground and Harry felt the stone against his back and the magical bindings tight around his arms. He looked at Hermione. She was already moving within the binding, hands working with small, precise motions. She'd been practicing wandless magic since 2nd year, the micro-motion spellwork that Remus had taught them both as a contingency for exactly this kind of situation. Her face was focused and not afraid. Peter came for Harry. Harry watched him come and thought about options. The ritual required his blood. That was the central piece, bone of the father, flesh of the servant, blood of the enemy. Without Harry's blood it couldn't complete. He could not prevent the first 2, he could make the third complicated. Before you do this, Harry said, tell me what he promised you. Peter hesitated, which was the first mistake, the one Harry had been waiting for, the proof that Peter Pettigrew, brilliant at survival, was not brilliant at commitment, because survivors don't commit to things that can be questioned. Power, Harry said. Protection, he promised you'd be safe. He keeps his promises, Peter said. He uses people until they stop being useful, Harry said. That's what he does. You told yourself it was a promise. You've been telling yourself that for 12 years. He held Peter's gaze. When was the last time he gave you something instead of taking? Peter's expression fractured just slightly, just for a moment, the complexity of 12 years of bad choices visible on his face in the torchlight, and Hermione's binding broke. The micro-motion spellwork completing itself, her hands free, her wand drawn in the same motion, and she hit Peter with a stupefy that came from the ground at an angle Peter hadn't calculated for, and Peter went sideways and the wand skittered across the gravel. Harry's binding loosened with hers, connected, the way their magic had always been connected, and he was up in a second. Harry looked at the cauldron. He looked at Hermione, who was already looking at it with the expression of someone doing very rapid magical analysis. Can we stop it? He said. Not without destroying it entirely, she said. If it's already at the 3rd stage, stopping the ritual halfway could. The incomplete form would be worse, more unpredictable. She was already moving around the cauldron, reading the magical signature. We'd need to either complete it or collapse it. Collapsing it at this stage requires fiendfire, Harry said. She looked at him, which neither of us knows how to cast. Yet, that's not helpful right now. She looked at the cauldron, then she looked at Peter unconscious on the ground, then at Cedric still stunned, then at Harry. If the ritual completes without the blood, it won't, Harry said. He'll find another way to complete it eventually, we know that. He thought about Sirius, about Remus. About the Horcruxes still out there and the shape of what was coming and everything Hermione had put in those notebooks over 3 years. He thought about the word eventually and what it meant in practical terms. If we collapse it now, Hermione said, following the thought with the precision she always used when they were thinking through something together, it buys time. It may destabilize whatever form he's already in. It may not. She paused. Or we could let it complete. Harry looked at her. Without the blood, she said, whatever forms won't be stable. It'll be partial, weaker than he intends, and we'll know the form it takes, and we'll know what happened tonight, and we'll have information we can actually use. She held his gaze. It's a terrible option. It's the best of the terrible options, Harry said. Yes, she said, that's what I thought. Neither of them moved for a moment. The cauldron bubbled. The graveyard was cold and dark and entirely still, except for the 2 of them standing at the center of it with all the accumulated weight of 14 years of being exactly who they were. Together, Harry said. Obviously, she said, they collapsed the cauldron. Hermione had the magical architecture of it mapped in 30 seconds, the structural magic she'd identified running the ritual, and they hit it simultaneously, Harry's instinctive kinetic force and Hermione's precise structural dismantling working the way their magic always worked, the combination creating something neither could produce alone. The cauldron didn't explode. It inverted, the way structures collapse when their foundation fails rather than their walls, folding in on itself with a sound like stone being drawn through water. What came out of it was formless, dark, the suggestion of a shape that was nothing like a body, a consciousness without an anchor, scattered by the incomplete ritual, the third ingredient absent, and the whole thing structurally compromised by their intervention. It screamed, not with a mouth, with something that hit the chest like a pressure wave. And then it was gone. Not dead. Harry knew it wasn't dead, felt this with the bone certainty of the thing in his scar that had always known the shape of what it was connected to, but gone, scattered, reduced, set back by years. The graveyard was quiet. Harry looked at the space where it had been. He looked at Hermione. She had her wand arm lowered and she was looking at the same space with the expression she wore after large things, the one that processed and assessed and filed before it let itself feel. Peter, Harry said. Stunned, she said. Still, we need to take him back. Yes, she looked at him. Are you all right? He considered the honest answer. Yeah, he said. I think so. He looked at his hands, which were steady. You? Yes, she said, and then with the specific honesty of someone who had agreed to have a conversation properly and was acknowledging that the proper time had arrived. I was frightened. When I felt it in the stands and I knew. I know, Harry said. I felt it too. The pull, she said. Yeah, they stood in the graveyard for a moment in the quiet that follows something large. The torches burned low and the headstones stood patient in the dark, and somewhere in the distance a bird was registering the approaching dawn with premature optimism. Harry looked at her. She was looking back at him, and she wasn't performing steadiness anymore, wasn't being precise for the benefit of the situation. She was just there, entirely present, the warm, clear, particular reality of her. After, he said, reminding them both of the word they'd agreed on in the library. We're after now, she said. He looked at her. The library, he said. I said I wanted to have that conversation properly. You did, she said. I still do. He paused. But I also want to say one thing right now here because I think it belongs here. She waited. She was very good at waiting when it mattered. The second task, Harry said. What they took. I told you I thought the assessment was wrong. He looked at her with the complete directness he'd been building toward for months or years or 14 years, depending on where you counted from. It wasn't wrong about Ron. Ron is my first real friend, and that's completely true. But if they'd taken you, he stopped, considered the words. There isn't a version of that where I finished the task. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of something being confirmed rather than revealed. I know, Hermione said for the third time, different weight again, the weight of someone who needed to hear it said plainly and is glad it was. The bond grew from something real, Harry said. Yes, she said, and the real thing was always there, he said. For we had words for it. Before I had words for it, it was always exactly this. She looked at him. Something moved through her face that was the unguarded version of her, the version that didn't curate itself, that had no editorial instinct, that was just Hermione, fully present and feeling everything she was feeling without the usual scaffolding of precision to organize it. I've been yours since before I knew what that meant, she said. Since before either of us had words for anything. She paused, and it's not the bond. Or it is, but the bond is just the world confirming what was already true. Harry reached over and took her hand the way he had in the hospital wing at the end of second year, not dramatic, not performed, just simple and certain. She looked at their hands, then up at him. He kissed her. Briefly, clean, with the same quality his most important actions had always had, no hesitation, entirely intentional, entirely itself. She kissed him back, and there was a moment that was the two of them in a graveyard at dawn with everything behind them and everything ahead, and it was the most them the moment could possibly have been, and it lasted exactly as long as it needed to. When they pulled back, she was looking at him with the expression she had when something she'd been working toward for a long time was finally, properly real. We need to get Cedric home, she said. I know, Harry said. And Peter, I know. And then we need to tell Sirius and Remus what happened tonight. I know, he paused. That conversation is going to take a while. Yes, she said, but then there's the other conversation, the proper one. The library, he said. Somewhere better than a graveyard, she said. He looked around at the headstones and the grey dawn and the unconscious Peter Pettigrew and the collapsed cauldron. Fair point, he said. She didn't let go of his hand. They went to Cedric, and Harry woke him with a renovate and explained in 3 efficient sentences what had happened and what they needed to do next. And Cedric looked between Harry and Hermione with the slightly dazed perception of a boy coming out of a stunning spell who was nonetheless clearly registering the quality of how they were standing next to each other. Right, Cedric said without remarking on any of it. The cup will take us back. I've still got it. Grab Peter, Harry said to Hermione, who was already performing a levitation on the unconscious form, and the 3 of them took the return portkey together. They landed on the Quidditch pitch to a crowd that did not fully understand what it was seeing but understood enough to go quiet, and then loud, and then quiet again when the teachers arrived, and the situation resolved itself into the controlled chaos of authority responding to something it hadn't prepared for. Dumbledore was there. He looked at Harry and Hermione together, and at Peter Pettigrew floating 2 feet off the ground between them, and at Cedric holding the cup, and he looked briefly and completely surprised. Not the managed surprise of a man performing an emotion, genuine, recalibrated surprise, the surprise of someone whose model of events has been revised by events. He said to Harry, "What happened?" "The graveyard," Harry said. "The cup was a portkey." Wormtail was running a resurrection ritual incomplete. We collapsed it. He looked at Dumbledore steadily. Voldemort is scattered, not gone, set back. The incomplete ritual destabilized what he had. He paused. We need to talk about Horcruxes tonight, all of us. Dumbledore looked at him, then at Hermione, then very briefly at their joined hands, which neither of them had made any effort to disengage. Yes, Dumbledore said, all of us tonight. Sirius arrived through the castle flew 17 minutes later, which meant he'd been waiting for a signal, which meant he'd known enough to wait. He came through at a run and stopped when he saw Harry and Hermione standing in the entrance hall and did the full-body check, the one he'd been doing since they were 1 year old, and he'd stood over a cot in Bristol counting their breaths. Graveyard, Harry said. We are fine. Peter's in ministry custody. Voldemort's, we'll explain. Sirius covered the distance between them and pulled both of them in with an arm around each. The complete fierce grip of someone who'd been holding his breath for 3 hours, and Harry felt Hermione's hand still in his between them and felt the warmth of Sirius's arm and the whole accumulated weight of everything, 14 years of it. The kitchen table and the library and the sitting room fire and the biscuits and the letters and the Patronus and the graveyard and the dawn. And it was so much and so real that he had to close his eyes for a moment. Remus arrived a minute later and embraced Hermione with both arms, which he didn't usually do in groups, which told both of them something about how the last 3 hours had been at Grimmauld Place. She held on for a second longer than she usually allowed herself to, and he let her, and didn't say anything, which was the right thing. Dumbledore's office that night was the longest conversation of Harry's life, up to that point. He and Hermione presented what they'd observed and concluded about Moody, confirmed by Dumbledore, who had already found the real Mad-Eye in a trunk, and Harry walked through the graveyard event in full, and Hermione supplemented with the magical analysis, and Sirius asked questions that cut to the structural heart of each answer, and Remus took notes in the small, precise script he used when the notes mattered. When they were done, Dumbledore was quiet for a while. You should know, he said finally to Harry, that the prophecy I mentioned in my letter, I think it is time to tell you its full content. Harry looked at him. All right, Dumbledore recited it. Neither can live while the other survives. The words landed in the room with the specific gravity of old things being confirmed. Harry sat with it. He'd known the shape of it, had known the shape since he'd read Sirius's letter, and thought about what it meant to be connected to Voldemort through a scar and a failed curse and 12 years of accumulated history. He sat with the full text of it now in Dumbledore's office, with the portraits sleeping on their frames and Sirius next to him and Hermione on his other side. The Horcruxes have to go first, Harry said. Yes, Dumbledore said, all of them, and we know there are at least 6 others. I believe so. Then that's what we do, Harry said. We find them, we destroy them, and when that's done, he paused, we'll deal with what's left. He said it with the complete, undecorated certainty of someone who has looked at a large thing and decided to walk toward it rather than away from it. And the thing was large, but he was not alone in it, had never been alone in it, and the room contained the 4 people most responsible for who he was, and the bond ran warm and constant at his left side, and the stag was always there when he needed it, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Outside Dumbledore's office windows, the June dawn was fully arrived, pink and gold over the Hogwarts grounds, and somewhere below the castle the lake was catching the light, and Hagrid's pumpkins were enormous, and the owlery was just waking, and the whole extraordinary, improbable living structure of the place that had been home was settling into a new day with the patience of very old stone that has seen everything and is still standing. Hermione's hand found his under the table. He turned his palm over. Dumbledore, who saw most things, looked at his desk with great interest in a piece of parchment that didn't require his attention. Sirius looked at the ceiling. Remus looked at his notes. Harry looked at Hermione. She looked back at him with the dark eyes that had been looking at him since before either of them had memory enough to know it, with the expression that was entirely hers, precise and warm and completely, irrevocably present, and something passed between them that was beyond the bond and beneath it and through it and simply itself. 2 people who had been reaching for each other since the first night, who had been known to each other since before knowing was possible, who had been built into each other by years and love and magic and choice, and who had chosen and would keep choosing because that was what it was. That was always what it had been. Outside the dawn kept coming, bright and indifferent and entirely new, and inside the 4 of them and the room and the old castle held everything they were, and it was the beginning.